Hello everyone, I am the storyteller and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. The first time it happened, I thought someone was dying outside my bedroom window. It was a Tuesday afternoon in late October, one of those gray days when the light never quite manages to break through the clouds, leaving everything suspended in a perpetual dusk. I'd been working the night shift at the warehouse for 3 months, and my sleep schedule had become a twisted thing. Snatches of rest stolen during daylight hours, while the rest of the world moved forward without me. I was drifting somewhere between consciousness and sleep when the voices started. At first, they were just murmurs, indistinct sounds filtering through the cheap aluminum blinds that covered my ground floor apartment window. The building was old, its walls thin enough that I'd grown accustomed to hearing fragments of my neighbors' lives, footsteps overhead, muffled television programs, the occasional argument that would spiral up from the courtyard. But these voices were different. They carried an urgency that made my skin crawl, a desperate quality that suggested something terrible was unfolding just beyond my view. I tried to move, to get up and investigate, but my body had already surrendered to that familiar prison of sleep paralysis. My limbs felt like they were encased in concrete, my chest compressed by an invisible weight that made each breath a conscious effort. The voices grew clearer, though their words remained frustratingly elusive. There were at least 3 distinct speakers, 2 that sounded female, 1 decidedly male. They spoke in hushed, rapid tones, as if sharing secrets that weren't meant for human ears. I strained to make out their words, my heart hammering against my ribs as the paralysis held me captive. Then, cutting through the urgent whispers like a blade through silk, came a single word, spoken in a voice so harsh and guttural it seemed to scrape its way up from some subterranean throat. Banana! The effect was immediate and absolute. The voices stopped. The oppressive weight on my chest lifted. My fingers twitched, then my toes. And suddenly, I could move again. I bolted upright, sweat soaking through my t-shirt, and stumbled to the window. My hands shook as I pulled the cord to raise the blinds. The courtyard was empty. Completely, utterly empty. I stood there for several minutes, scanning every shadow, every corner where someone might hide. Nothing. The autumn wind pushed dead leaves across the cracked concrete, but there was no sign that anyone had been there at all. Over the following weeks, I told myself it had been a particularly vivid hypnagogic hallucination. Sleep paralysis was notorious for producing terrifying auditory and visual experiences, and working nights had clearly disrupted my brain's ability to distinguish between sleep and waking states. I'd read about it online, found comfort in the clinical explanations and message board posts from others who'd experienced similar episodes. But then it happened again. This time, the word was pickles, shouted with the same grinding, inhuman voice that seemed to originate from somewhere much deeper than any throat should allow. Again, the immediate cessation of the whispered conversation. Again, the empty courtyard when I finally managed to reach the window. By the 4th episode, I'd started keeping a notebook beside my bed. Each incident followed the same pattern. The urgent voices growing more distinct but never quite intelligible, followed by that single absurd word that ended everything instantly. The words were always ridiculous. Spaghetti, rubber duck, cheese grater, spoken with such violent intensity that they seemed to tear through the fabric of whatever was happening outside my window. I began to notice other details. The episodes only occurred during afternoon naps, never during my nighttime sleep before work. The temperature in my room would drop noticeably just before the voices started, enough that I could see my breath in small puffs. Most disturbing of all, I started to realize that despite the paralysis, despite my inability to move or speak, part of me was beginning to anticipate the ridiculous conclusion to each episode with something that felt uncomfortably close to amusement. The first time I caught myself almost smiling when the gravelly voice shouted, "Marshmallow." I knew something was seriously wrong. Dr. Peterson, my physician, suggested I was experiencing a combination of sleep deprivation, and stress-induced hallucinations. She prescribed sleeping pills and recommended I consider switching to day shifts. The pills helped with the insomnia, but did nothing to stop the episodes. If anything, they seemed to make the voices clearer, more persistent. I started researching sleep paralysis more seriously, diving deep into medical journals and case studies. What I found should have been reassuring. Sleep paralysis affected millions of people worldwide, often accompanied by auditory hallucinations and feelings of presence. The brain, caught between sleep and waking states, could conjure incredibly realistic sensory experiences. But none of the literature mentioned voices that seemed to need something from the person experiencing the paralysis. None described entities that appeared to feed on specific emotional responses, because that's what it felt like was happening. With each episode, I became more convinced that whatever was speaking outside my window wasn't content to simply whisper among themselves. They wanted something from me, and somehow, they'd learned that the absurd interruptions could provoke the exact response they sought. The realization crystallized during what I came to think of as the rubber chicken episode. As the harsh voice delivered its punchline, I felt my mouth twitch involuntarily, fighting against the paralysis to form what would have been a smile. In that moment, I understood with horrible clarity that whatever was out there had discovered my weakness, that despite my fear, despite the terror that gripped me during each episode, some primitive part of my brain found their ridiculous outbursts genuinely funny. And they knew it. I tried everything I could think of to break the cycle. I moved my mattress away from the window, bought blackout curtains to replace the blinds, even slept in the living room for a week. Nothing worked. The episodes continued with clockwork regularity, always during those vulnerable afternoon hours when exhaustion forced me into fitful rest. The voices grew more confident, more experimental with their word choices. Banana hammock brought forth that grinding laughter from my paralyzed throat, a sound I couldn't control, couldn't stop, that seemed to bubble up from somewhere deep in my chest. Squeaky cheese made my whole body vibrate with suppressed mirth, even as terror flooded my system. I started to understand why they chose such absurd words. Fear alone wasn't enough for them. They needed the complex cocktail of emotions that came from finding something genuinely, inexplicably funny in the midst of a terrifying experience. They were harvesting something more nuanced than simple terror. They were feeding on the specific flavor of laughter born from cognitive dissonance. The breakthrough came when I decided to record one of the episodes. I set up my phone with a voice recording app, positioning it near the window before settling down for my afternoon rest. If I could capture evidence of the voices, prove to myself and others that something external was happening, I might finally understand what I was dealing with. The episode that followed was the longest yet. The voices whispered for nearly 10 minutes before the interruption came, a word so perfectly, absurdly inappropriate that I couldn't suppress the laughter that escaped my paralyzed lips. Kumquat. When I could move again, I immediately grabbed my phone to check the recording. 93 minutes of audio, crystal clear, capturing every moment of the episode. My blood turned to ice water as I listened to the playback. There were no voices, no whispered conversations, no harsh interruptions, just the sound of my own breathing, growing progressively more labored, followed by a single moment where I could hear myself laughing. A low, involuntary chuckle that sounded utterly insane in the context of complete silence. I played the recording 17 times that evening, adjusting the volume, using different headphones, running it through audio enhancement software I downloaded specifically for this purpose. The result was always the same. No voices. Just me, alone in my room, laughing at nothing. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was what I noticed in the days that followed. People had started to look at me differently. The clerk at the grocery store, who'd always been friendly, now seemed nervous when I approached his counter. My neighbor, Mrs. Chen, who used to wave when she saw me in the hallway, had begun hurrying past with her eyes downcast. At first I thought I was being paranoid, but then I overheard my upstairs neighbor talking to someone on his balcony, his voice carrying clearly through the thin walls. Every afternoon like clockwork, just laughing to himself in there, sometimes for 10-15 minutes straight. It's getting worse. The person he was talking to, His girlfriend, I thought, responded with something I couldn't quite make out, but her tone was clearly sympathetic. "I know," my neighbor continued. "I feel bad for the guy, but it's starting to creep us all out. Mrs. Chen thinks we should call someone." I pressed my ear against the ceiling, straining to hear more, but they'd moved inside. That night I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to reconcile what I knew to be true. The voices, the episodes, the entity that needed my laughter to leave, with the growing evidence that I was simply losing my mind. The recording had captured only my own voice. My neighbors heard only inexplicable laughter coming from my apartment, but I knew what I'd experienced. The whispered conversations were real. The harsh interruptions were real. The way the temperature dropped, the way the paralysis lifted immediately after each ridiculous word. All of it was real, wasn't it? The next afternoon, I lay down for my usual nap with a new plan. Instead of fighting the paralysis, instead of straining to hear the voices more clearly, I would simply observe. I would pay attention to every detail, catalog every sensation, and try to understand the mechanism behind what was happening to me. The voices started right on schedule. 3 distinct speakers engaged in their urgent, whispered conversation. But this time, instead of trying to make out their words, I focused on the quality of the sound itself, the way it seemed to come from multiple directions simultaneously, the way it felt less like hearing and more like remembering, as if the voices were playing back conversations I'd already heard, but couldn't quite place. When the harsh interruption came, "Waffle iron," delivered with that same grinding intensity, I felt the familiar urge to laugh bubble up from my chest. But instead of fighting it or giving into it, I simply observed the sensation. I noticed how the laughter felt both involuntary and chosen, both foreign and familiar. And in that moment of observation, something shifted. The voices didn't stop immediately. Instead, they seemed to falter, their whispered urgency taking on a note of confusion. The harsh voice tried again. "Waffle iron." But this time, the word came out uncertain, almost questioning. I felt no urge to laugh. The word hung in the air, stripped of its absurd power, just another meaningless sound. The whispered conversation resumed, but now I could hear something like desperation in their tone. They were trying different approaches, different rhythms, different levels of urgency. Finally, the harsh voice returned with increased volume. "Penguin pajamas." Nothing. No laughter. No amusement. Just a vague sense of pity for whatever was so desperately trying to manipulate my emotions. The voices grew frantic now, overlapping each other in their urgency. The harsh interruptions came rapid fire. "Banana phone," "disco potato," "rubber vampire." Each word more absurd than the last, each delivered with increasing desperation. But I'd found the key. The moment I stopped participating in their game, stopped feeding them the specific emotional response they craved, they lost their power over me. The episodes ended abruptly, just as they always had. But this time, when I went to the window and raised the blinds, I saw something that made my blood freeze. Standing in the courtyard, looking directly up at my window, was a man I didn't recognize. He was tall and thin, wearing clothes that seemed to belong to no particular era. A coat that might have been from the 1940s, pants that looked distinctly modern, shoes that could have come from any decade. His face was gaunt, his eyes sunken, and he was smiling with an expression of profound hunger. As our eyes met, he raised one pale hand and waved. Then he opened his mouth impossibly wide and spoke in that same harsh, grinding voice I'd been hearing for months. "Thank you for feeding us." I stumbled backward from the window, my heart hammering so hard I thought it might burst. When I looked again, the courtyard was empty, but I knew he'd be back. They all would. Because now I understood what they were, what they needed, and why they'd chosen me. I was their comedian, their unwilling entertainer, and even though I'd learned to resist their manipulations, even though I'd discovered the mechanism behind their power, I also knew with terrible certainty that this was far from over. Because the worst part wasn't that I'd been feeding them my laughter for months. The worst part was that now I missed it. In the silence of my apartment, surrounded by neighbors who thought I was insane, isolated from any meaningful human connection. I found myself actually longing for those afternoon visits. They were the only time I felt genuinely connected to anything, even if that connection was built on manipulation and fear. And sometimes, late at night when the world was completely quiet, I caught myself wondering what would happen if I started laughing on purpose, if I gave them what they wanted willingly, if I became their partner instead of their victim. The thought terrified me more than anything else that had happened, because I was beginning to suspect that's exactly what they'd been planning all along. Story 2. The first time it happened, I convinced myself I was losing my mind. Graduate school had already pushed me to the edge. Sleepless nights hunched over research papers, subsisting on instant coffee and the occasional granola bar. The studio apartment I'd found was all I could afford, a cramped box on the third floor of a building that had seen better decades. The previous tenant had left behind the lingering scent of mothballs, and something else I couldn't quite identify, something that reminded me of old churches. The walls were thin enough that I could hear Mrs. Chen next door practicing her violin at precisely 7 each morning, and the radiator clanged like a prisoner rattling chains. But it was mine, and after sharing a dorm room for 4 years, the solitude felt like luxury. That first evening when Jake and Sarah came over, I was grateful for the company. We'd been friends since undergrad, and their presence filled the hollow spaces of my new home with familiar laughter. Sarah brought wine, Jake brought his guitar, and for a few hours the apartment felt less like a temporary shelter and more like a beginning. We were maybe an hour into catching up when I heard it, a sound so soft I initially mistook it for the building's old pipes settling. A low, melodic humming that seemed to emanate from somewhere deep within the walls themselves. But as the conversation continued, the sound grew clearer, more distinct. Gregorian chant, hauntingly beautiful and completely impossible. I excused myself to check the neighbors, thinking perhaps Mrs. Chen had expanded her musical repertoire, but the hallway was silent, and the melody seemed to follow me, growing stronger as I returned to my apartment. Sarah and Jake hadn't noticed anything, absorbed as they were in Jake's story about his new job at the research lab. That's when I felt for my keys in my pocket and found nothing. The keys had been there moments before. I distinctly remembered the familiar weight of them, the way the metal felt warm against my leg through the fabric. But now my pocket was empty, and the chanting seemed to pulse with newfound intensity, as if responding to my discovery. I searched frantically, trying not to alarm my friends. Under the couch cushions, on the kitchen counter, by the door, nothing. The melody continued, a wordless Latin prayer that made the air feel thick and charged, like the moments before a thunderstorm. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the chanting stopped. Jake was mid-sentence when he paused, looking around with a puzzled expression. "Did you hear that?" he asked. "Sounded like singing." Sarah shrugged, refilling her wine glass. "Probably just the neighbors. Old buildings carry sound weird." 3 hours later, after they'd left and I'd given up searching, I found my keys hanging from the inside door handle, a place I'd checked at least 5 times. They were cold to the touch, as if they'd been sitting in a freezer, and when I lifted them, I could swear I caught the faint echo of that ethereal melody. The second incident happened 2 weeks later when Marcus visited. This time I was prepared, or thought I was. I'd started keeping track of my keys obsessively, checking their location every few minutes like a nervous tick. But preparation proved useless against the inexplicable. Marcus had brought beer and textbooks, planning to study together for our comprehensive exams. We'd spread our materials across the small coffee table, creating a fortress of highlighters and sticky notes. The apartment felt different with him there, warmer somehow, less prone to the odd drafts that seemed to appear from nowhere. The chanting began around 9:30, just as Marcus was explaining a particularly complex theoretical framework. This time, I was watching for it, listening with every fiber of my being. The sound seemed to rise from beneath the floorboards, weaving itself through the walls like smoke. It was the same melody as before, but more complex now, as if multiple voices had joined the invisible choir. My hand went immediately to my pocket. Empty. But this time, I saw something else. A shadow in the doorway to the kitchenette, tall and perfectly still. The figure stood just beyond the reach of the living room's lamplight, but I could make out its general shape. Broad shoulders, an elongated neck, arms that hung at unnatural angles. It didn't move, didn't breathe that I could tell, but there was something about its posture that suggested intense concentration, like a conductor preparing for a particularly challenging piece. I blinked, and it was gone. Marcus was still talking, oblivious to the supernatural symphony playing around us. The chanting continued for another hour, rising and falling in waves that seemed to match the rhythm of my heartbeat. When it finally stopped, Marcus commented on how quiet the building had become, as if the absence of sound was somehow more noticeable than its presence had been. My keys reappeared in the bathroom medicine cabinet, nestled between the toothpaste and a bottle of aspirin I didn't remember buying. I started researching then, diving into the apartment building's history with the same intensity I brought to my academic work. The building had been constructed in 1923, originally serving as a boarding house for seminary students. The third floor, my floor, had housed the chapel, a small space where morning prayers were conducted daily until the building's conversion to apartments in the 1960s. The records were sparse, but I found mentions of unusual acoustic properties in the renovation reports, notes about sounds carrying strangely through the building's structure. One document referenced the need to address the persistent echo effects in Unit 3B, my apartment. The discoveries should have been reassuring, providing rational explanations for the auditory phenomena. Old buildings had quirks, strange acoustics, phantom sounds, but they only made me more uneasy, as if I was uncovering something that was meant to remain buried. The third occurrence came during a dinner party I'd foolishly decided to host. 4 friends this time, Sarah, Jake, Marcus, and Elena from my program. I'd spent the day cooking, cleaning, trying to make the sparse apartment feel welcoming. The effort had exhausted me more than it should have, leaving me jittery and hyper-aware of every creak and sigh the building made. Elena arrived first, bringing flowers and compliments about the apartment's authentic vintage charm. She had a way of making even the most mundane things sound significant, and I found myself relaxing slightly in her presence. But as the others arrived and the apartment filled with conversation and laughter, I felt the familiar tension building in my chest. The chanting began at 10:15, right in the middle of Elena's animated description of her thesis research. This time it was different, richer, more complex, as if an entire monastery had taken residence in my walls. The melody wove itself through our conversation like a living thing, sometimes harmonizing with the cadence of speech, sometimes creating haunting counterpoint. And this time, my friends began to notice. Sarah tilted her head during a pause in conversation, frowning slightly. Jake's hand went to his ear as if trying to clear it. Marcus looked around the room with the same puzzled expression I'd seen before. But it was Elena who spoke first, her voice barely above a whisper. "Does anyone else hear that singing?" The question hung in the air like incense, heavy and charged. I felt my pocket, empty, of course, and looked toward the doorway. The figure was there again, more distinct now, its impossibly tall frame filling the space between kitchen and living room. Its arms moved in slow, deliberate gestures, conducting the invisible choir with movements that seemed to pull the melody from the very structure of the building. For a moment, just a moment, Elena's eyes met mine, and I saw something there that made my blood freeze. Recognition, fear, but also something else, a kind of knowing that suggested she was seeing exactly what I was seeing. Then Jake laughed nervously and suggested someone upstairs must be playing music, and the moment shattered like glass. The chanting faded gradually, reluctantly, as if being pulled back into whatever depths had birthed it. The figure in the doorway dissolved into shadow and suggestion. When my friends left an hour later, they seemed eager to go, making excuses about early morning classes and unfinished assignments. Elena lingered at the door, her hand on the frame, looking back into the apartment with an expression I couldn't read. "Be careful," she said quietly. and I wasn't sure if she was warning me or asking me to warn her. My keys were in the refrigerator, wrapped in a dishcloth I'd never seen before. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed listening to the building's night sounds, the settling wood, the distant traffic, Mrs. Chen's restless movements next door. Somewhere around 3 a.m., I heard footsteps in the hallway, slow and measured, pausing outside my door. They stood there for what felt like hours, though the clock showed only minutes passing. When I finally gathered the courage to look through the peephole, the hallway was empty. The next morning, I started researching lunar eclipses. It was a desperate reach, born of insomnia and too much coffee. But something about the timing of the incidents nagged at me. The first occurrence had been on September 18th, the second on October 8th, the third on October 28th. What I found made me question everything I thought I understood about coincidence. Each date corresponded to a lunar eclipse, not always visible from our location, but astronomically significant nonetheless. The September eclipse had been partial, visible from Antarctica. The October events had been penumbral eclipses, barely detectable but recorded by observatories worldwide. The pattern was undeniable, but acknowledging it meant accepting something far more disturbing than acoustic anomalies or stress-induced hallucinations. It meant admitting that whatever was happening in my apartment was connected to celestial events occurring hundreds of thousands of miles away. I started tracking eclipse schedules obsessively, marking dates on my calendar with a growing sense of dread. The next significant lunar event was November 19th, a partial eclipse visible from North America. I had 2 weeks to decide whether to test my theory or spend the evening elsewhere, pretending none of this was real. But even as I made plans to stay with Jake that night, I knew I wouldn't follow through. The apartment had become more than my home. It had become a laboratory, and I was both researcher and test subject. The thought of missing the next occurrence, of not knowing what might happen or what I might learn, was unbearable. Besides, there was Elena's reaction to consider. The way she'd looked at me, the warning in her voice, suggested I wasn't the only one experiencing something beyond normal explanation. If this was madness, it might be contagious. If it was real, it might be dangerous to ignore. I spent the intervening days in a state of heightened awareness, cataloging every sound, every shadow, every moment when my keys felt heavier or lighter than they should. The apartment began to feel like a living thing, breathing around me, watching me with invisible eyes. Even in daylight, I caught glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision, suggestions of presence that vanished when I turned to look directly. The building's other residents started nodding to me in the hallways with expressions that seemed knowing, as if they were privy to secrets I was only beginning to understand. Mrs. Chen's violin practice took on new urgency, her melodies sometimes echoing the Gregorian fragments that haunted my memory. The superintendent, an elderly man I'd barely noticed before, began appearing at odd hours, always near my door, always with some excuse about checking pipes or testing smoke detectors. November 19th arrived gray and cold, the kind of day that seemed to leach color from everything it touched. I'd invited no one over, but found myself preparing anyway, cleaning the apartment, arranging furniture, setting out snacks as if expecting guests. The compulsion felt foreign yet familiar, like muscle memory from someone else's life. As evening approached, I felt the familiar tension building in my chest, but amplified now, electric with possibility and dread. I checked my keys obsessively, keeping them in my hand rather than my pocket, feeling their weight and warmth like a talisman against whatever was coming. The eclipse would reach maximum at 9:42 p.m. local time. At 9:30, the chanting began. But this time was different. This time I understood that I was not alone in my vigil. This time I realized that some invitations are issued in frequencies the conscious mind cannot detect, sent out on celestial tides to anyone sensitive enough to receive them. The keys in my hand grew cold as winter metal, and I watched, truly watched, as they faded from visible to translucent to gone, disappearing not into space but into some adjacent reality, where Gregorian melodies served as bridges between what is and what might be. The tall figure in my doorway raised its arms, and for the first time, I saw its face. It was my own. Story 3. The first time it happened, I convinced myself it was a malfunction. I'd been house-sitting the Hartwell estate for 3 weeks when the motion sensors began their midnight performance. The sprawling mansion sat on 12 acres of Connecticut woodland, and Marcus Hartwell, CEO of some pharmaceutical conglomerate, had hired me to maintain the property while he spent 6 months in Singapore. Good money for easy work. Water the plants, collect the mail, keep the place from falling into disrepair. The sensors were state-of-the-art, installed throughout the main house and grounds. During the day, they functioned perfectly, detecting my movements with precision, illuminating hallways and rooms as I performed my duties. But at night, they took on a life of their own. It began on a Tuesday. I was reading in the main library when the first light flickered on in the foyer, then another in the hallway, then another. A steady progression of illumination moving through the house like a slow-burning fuse. I followed the trail, expecting to find a raccoon, or perhaps a deer that had triggered the outdoor sensors. But the path led methodically through the mansion's corridors, up the main staircase, and out through the back terrace doors. The lights continued across the manicured lawn, past the ornamental garden, straight to the detached garage with its small apartment above. The motion sensors there blazed to life one by one, creating a luminous staircase leading to the second-floor entrance. I stood at the bottom of those wooden steps, flashlight heavy in my hand, and felt the first whisper of wrongness. The night air carried no sound of retreating wildlife. No rustling in the bushes, no snap of breaking twigs. Just silence, thick and expectant. The apartment door stood slightly ajar. I climbed those steps with the careful deliberation of a man who knows he's crossing a threshold he can't uncross. The motion sensor at the landing triggered as I approached, flooding the small entryway with harsh white light. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The sadness hit me like a physical weight. It wasn't my sadness. I understood that immediately. This was something older, deeper, more profound than any emotion I'd ever experienced. It pressed against my chest, made my throat constrict, filled my eyes with tears I couldn't explain. The apartment itself was unremarkable. A studio layout with basic furniture, kitchenette, small bathroom. Everything clean and undisturbed, as if waiting for an occupant who would never arrive. But the feeling was overwhelming. As if the very walls were saturated with grief, as if despair had seeped into the foundation stones and now radiated outward like heat from a furnace. I left quickly that first night, telling myself it was the isolation getting to me. 3 weeks alone in a mansion could affect anyone's mental state. The next morning, I called Hartwell's assistant and asked about the apartment. She mentioned it had been used for a live-in groundskeeper years ago, but had been empty since the previous caretaker left. Nothing more. The lights stayed quiet for a week. Then they started again. This time, I was prepared. I set up a chair in the library with a clear view of the foyer and waited. At 2:17 a.m., the first sensor activated, then the second. The same deliberate progression through the house, across the grounds, up to the garage apartment. I followed again, driven by a curiosity that felt less like my own with each step. The sadness was waiting for me, stronger this time. It seemed to recognize me, to wrap around me like an old coat. I explored the apartment more thoroughly, searching for any clue that might explain the sensation. In the bathroom medicine cabinet, I found a prescription bottle. The label was mostly faded, but I could make out part of a name. Omus Brennan, and a date from 3 years ago. Antidepressants. The pieces began forming a picture I didn't want to see. Over the following nights, the pattern repeated with metronomic regularity. The lights would activate, always following the same path, always leading me to that apartment where sorrow hung in the air like fog. Each visit, the sadness grew more familiar, more welcoming. I began to understand its texture, its depth. It was the sadness of profound loneliness, of dreams abandoned, of a life that had slowly drained of color until only gray remained. I researched Thomas Brennan. Local newspaper archives revealed little, a brief mention in an obituary section. Thomas Brennan, 34, former groundskeeper at the Hartwell estate, found deceased in his apartment. No foul play suspected. The date matched the prescription bottle, but the research only deepened the mystery. According to the records, Brennan had been found in his own apartment downtown, not in the garage apartment. He'd never lived there. The groundskeeper position had been eliminated 2 years before his death when Hartwell downsized the maintenance staff. I tried to dismiss the lights after that, to ignore their nightly summons, but they grew more insistent. The sensors would activate in rapid succession, casting frantic shadows through the house. Sometimes they would pulse, on, off, like a heartbeat or a distress signal. The urgency was unmistakable. On the night I finally stopped following them, I learned why they needed me there. I sat in the library, determined to break the cycle, reading while the lights performed their desperate dance. But as the house fell back into darkness, I heard it. Footsteps on the gravel path outside, slow and measured, moving toward the main house. My blood turned to ice water. The footsteps circled the mansion methodically, pausing at each window, each door. I could track their progress by the subtle shift of shadows, the faint crunch of dried leaves. When they reached the French doors of the library, they stopped. The handle turned. I sat frozen, watching the door swing open to reveal nothing but empty darkness. The footsteps entered the room, moving across the hardwood floor with impossible heaviness for something I couldn't see. They approached my chair, circled it once, twice, then stopped directly in front of me. The temperature plummeted. My breath came out in visible puffs, and in that glacial air, I felt a presence lean close, felt it studying me with the intensity of desperate hope. The whisper, when it came, seemed to rise from the floorboards themselves. "Why won't you come?" I understood then with crystalline clarity. The lights weren't malfunctioning. They weren't even being triggered by motion. They were being activated by will, by need, by something that had been waiting in that apartment for 3 years. Something that had mistaken me for someone else. Something that believed I was Thomas Brennan coming home. But Brennan had never lived there, had never even worked there when he died. So what was waiting for him? What had been calling to him through circuits and sensors, through the electronic nervous system of a smart home that somehow bridged the gap between the living and the lost? I followed the lights that night, as I knew I would, as I'd always been meant to. The sadness welcomed me like an old friend. But underneath it now I sensed something else. A terrible, patient hunger. The apartment felt different, more solid somehow, as if my repeated visits had strengthened whatever dwelt there. In the corner where I'd never looked before, I found them. Dozens of photographs scattered across a small table. Pictures of the Hartwell estate, taken from various angles, at different times of day. Pictures of the garage apartment, the windows, the door, and in several of them, taken with a telephoto lens from the tree line, a figure barely visible in the apartment windows. Thomas Brennan had been watching this place, obsessing over it. The prescription bottle, the depression, the final desperate act. It all made sense now. He'd been drawn here, compelled by something he couldn't understand or resist, just as I was being drawn. The photographs were signed on the back in fading ink. One day I'll belong there. One day I'll be home. But he'd never made it. He died alone in his downtown apartment, 3 miles away from this place that had called to him. And now, something was using his unfulfilled longing, his desperate need to belong somewhere, to draw others into its web. I ran from the apartment that night, but I knew it was too late. The sadness followed me now, clung to my clothes, my skin, my thoughts. During the day, I found myself staring out the library windows at the garage apartment. At night, I lay awake listening for the soft click of motion sensors activating. The lights still guide me. Every night, the same path through the house, across the grounds, up those wooden steps. And every night, the sadness grows a little deeper, a little more familiar. The apartment feels more like home with each visit. I've stopped questioning whether it's real or a manifestation of isolation-induced psychosis. The distinction has become meaningless. What matters is that something needs me there, needs me to complete a journey that Thomas Brennan never finished. And I'm beginning to understand that I want to complete it too. The prescription in my name arrives tomorrow. I left specific instructions with the pharmacy. The lights are calling again. I can see them through the library windows, that familiar procession of illumination leading the way home. The motion sensors aren't malfunctioning, and I'm not being followed by them. I'm the one who activates them now. I'm the one drawing the path. And tomorrow night, I think I'll finally understand why the apartment has been waiting so long for someone to stay. Story 4. The streets taste different at 3 in the morning. There's something about the way asphalt breathes in the pre-dawn hours, exhaling the day's accumulated heat and exhaust in slow, poisonous sighs. The city sheds its daytime skin after midnight, revealing something rawer underneath. A network of shadows and empty doorways that seem to pulse with their own malevolent heartbeat. I've been walking these same routes for 8 months now, ever since the insomnia claimed me completely, and I've learned to read the subtle language of the darkness. The bagel shop on Meridian closes at 10, but Marcus, the night baker, leaves day-old everything bagels in a paper bag by the dumpster. He pretends not to notice when I take them, the same way I pretend not to notice the way his hands shake when he locks up. We're all haunted by something in this city. The difference is most people have the luxury of sleeping through their demons. I discovered Henry 3 weeks into my nocturnal wandering, hunched against the brick wall behind the old Paramount Theater. His cardboard sign read, "Veteran, anything helps," but his eyes held something deeper than simple desperation. They held recognition, as if he'd been waiting for me specifically to round that corner with my brown paper bag and restless energy. The first time I offered him a bagel, he looked at me with those watery blue eyes and said, "You're the coffee girl." I'd never seen him before in my life. "Coffee girl?" I asked, settling down beside him on the cold concrete. The alley smelled like stale beer and something organic and unpleasant, but Henry himself was surprisingly clean. Just worn down, like old leather left too long in the rain. "You smell like coffee," he explained, accepting the sesame bagel with hands that trembled slightly. "Even in the middle of the night, most folks, they smell like whatever they last ate, or their soap, or their troubles. But you always smell like fresh coffee." I didn't tell him I hadn't touched coffee in months. The caffeine made the sleeplessness worse, turned my already frayed nerves into live wires. I'd switched to herbal tea, then water, then nothing at all after sunset. But I just nodded and watched him eat, noting the careful way he savored each bite, making it last. That became our routine. I'd collect the bagels around 11:30, walk the circuitous route through downtown that somehow always led me past the Paramount by 3:15, and Henry would be there. We'd share the food in comfortable silence, occasionally exchanging observations about the night's peculiarities, the way certain streetlights flickered in Morse code patterns, the fact that the same stray cat always appeared exactly 4 blocks from the theater, the persistent sound of footsteps that seemed to echo our own but never quite matched our rhythm. It was Henry who first noticed the photographer. "There's someone following you," he said one Tuesday morning, not looking up from his plain bagel. His voice carried the matter-of-fact tone people use when discussing the weather. "Been watching you for 3 nights now." The skin between my shoulder blades prickled, responding to some primal warning system I'd thought civilization had bred out of me. "How do you know?" "Because he stops when you stop, hides when you turn around. And he's got one of those cameras, the kind that makes that little whirring sound when it focuses." I'd heard that sound, subtle, almost subliminal, like a mechanical whisper following me through the empty streets. I'd attributed it to the city's ambient noise, electrical transformers, air conditioning units, the distant hum of late-night traffic. But now that Henry mentioned it, the sound only occurred when I was walking alone, between the bagel shop and our meeting spot. "What does he look like?" I asked, though part of me didn't want to know. Henry's eyes went distant, focusing on something beyond the mouth of the alley. Medium height, dark coat, one of those baseball caps pulled down low. Keeps his distance, but he's persistent, patient. He paused, chewing thoughtfully. The kind of patient that means trouble. That night I varied my route. Instead of taking Meridian to 5th, then cutting through the business district, I went north on Elm, circled back through the residential area, approached the theater from the opposite direction. It added 20 minutes to my walk, but I told myself the extra exercise might help with the sleep situation. The whirring sound followed me anyway. By the time I reached Henry, my heart was performing an irregular percussion against my ribs. Sweat had gathered at the base of my neck despite the October chill, and every shadow seemed to conceal watching eyes. Henry took one look at my face and nodded knowingly. "He adapted," the old man said. "Smart ones always do." Smart ones? Predators. They learn, they adjust. Henry accepted his bagel but didn't start eating immediately. Instead, he scanned the street beyond the alley mouth with the focused attention of someone accustomed to evaluating threats. "But don't worry, coffee girl. I've got your back." I wanted to ask what exactly that meant. How a homeless veteran with trembling hands planned to protect me from someone who'd apparently turned stalking into an art form. But something in Henry's tone discouraged questions. There was a confidence there, a suggestion of capabilities that didn't match his circumstances. The next few nights passed in escalating tension. I tried different routes, different times, even skipped the bagel pickup entirely one evening and walked straight home. But the mechanical whisper persisted, and I began catching glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision. A figure ducking behind parked cars, slipping into doorways, maintaining a careful distance while documenting my every step. Then Henry started appearing everywhere, not just at the theater, though he was always there by 3:15, settling into his usual spot as if materializing from the brick wall itself. But I'd catch sight of him at other points during my walks, standing beneath a streetlight 2 blocks from the bagel shop, seemingly absorbed in reading a newspaper that rustled too loudly in the still air, leaning against a bus stop bench 4 blocks east, humming something tuneless under his breath, crossing the street ahead of me with that distinctive shuffling gait, always just far enough away that calling out would seem inappropriate. The strangest part was that his presence coincided perfectly with the disappearance of the whirring sound. Whenever I spotted Henry somewhere along my route, the mechanical whisper would fade, as if my photographer had suddenly lost interest or been called away on other business. But as soon as Henry vanished, which he did, with an uncanny ability to round corners and simply not be there when I reached the same spot, the sound would resume. "How are you doing it?" I asked him one morning, settling beside him with our shared breakfast. The question had been building in my chest for days, creating a pressure that demanded release. Doing what? Being everywhere, showing up right when that guy is following me. I studied his weathered face, looking for some tell, some indication of the mechanism behind his apparent omnipresence. "It's like you're intercepting him somehow." Henry's eyes crinkled at the corners. Not quite a smile, but something warmer than his usual stoic expression. "Told you I had your back. Man keeps his word, especially to someone who shares her food." "But how?" "Coffee girl," he interrupted gently. "Some questions are better left alone. Sometimes protection works best when you don't understand exactly how." I wanted to press further, but something in his tone suggested the conversation was over. Instead, I pulled out my phone, a relatively new model with a decent camera, and held it up between us. "Mind if I take a picture? I've been walking these streets for months, and you're the only good thing about them. I'd like to have something to remember this by." Henry's expression shifted, becoming unreadable. For a moment, I thought he might refuse. Then he shrugged and turned slightly toward the camera, not quite smiling, but not objecting either. I snapped 3 photos in quick succession, the phone's camera making tiny clicking sounds in the quiet alley. The first showed Henry in profile, the harsh streetlight creating dramatic shadows across his lined face. The second caught him looking directly at the lens, those watery blue eyes somehow both ancient and childlike. The third captured him reaching for another piece of bagel, his weathered hands a study in controlled tremors. At least, that's what I thought I'd photographed. It wasn't until the following evening, reviewing the images while waiting for sleep that would never come, that I noticed the problem. The photos showed the alley clearly: the brick wall with its layers of faded graffiti, the dumpster with its cargo of broken dreams, the scattered newspapers and cigarette butts that marked Henry's territory. They showed me too, sitting cross-legged on the concrete, my face bearing the hollow-eyed expression of chronic insomnia. But Henry wasn't there. In the first photo, I appeared to be having an animated conversation with empty air, my body angled toward a space where nothing existed except shadow. The second showed me smiling at absolutely nothing, my eyes focused on a patch of brick wall. The third was perhaps the most disturbing. My hands were extended, apparently offering food to an invisible recipient. I stared at the images until my eyes burned, zooming in and adjusting the brightness, looking for some technical explanation. Camera malfunction, unusual lighting conditions, some quirk of digital photography that could make a person disappear from an image while leaving everything else intact. But the photos were otherwise perfect. Every detail was crisp and clear, except for Henry. Sleep finally came that morning, but it brought no rest. I dreamed of empty alleys and mechanical whispers, of cameras that captured truth instead of reality, of protection that couldn't be photographed because it came from places cameras couldn't see. I woke at sunset with the taste of coffee in my mouth and the absolute certainty that I needed answers. The bagel shop felt different that night. Marcus avoided eye contact when I approached the dumpster, and his hand shook more violently than usual as he pretended to clean the counter through the window. The paper bag seemed lighter, containing only 2 bagels instead of the usual 4 or 5. Even the everything seasoning looked sparse, as if the universe was gradually withdrawing its small kindnesses. My route to the theater took on a dreamlike quality. Familiar landmarks seemed slightly off, the streetlights burning a shade too bright, the empty storefronts reflecting light from sources I couldn't identify, the persistent feeling that the city itself was holding its breath. The mechanical whirring started earlier than usual, beginning just 2 blocks from the shop and maintaining a steady rhythm that seemed to match my heartbeat. But no Henry appeared to chase it away. I reached the Paramount at 3:20, 5 minutes later than usual, and found the alley empty. Not just Henry absent, but genuinely vacant. No cardboard sign, no scattered newspapers, no depression in the concrete where a body had rested night after night. It looked like no one had ever been there at all. The whirring sound grew louder. I turned slowly, knowing what I'd find but needing to confirm it anyway. The photographer stood at the mouth of the alley, no longer bothering with concealment. Medium height, dark coat, baseball cap pulled low, exactly as Henry had described. But now I could see his face beneath the brim, pale and unremarkable except for eyes that reflected streetlight like an animal's. He raised his camera, a professional-looking device with a lens that seemed too large for practical use, and the mechanical whisper became a sustained whir as the autofocus engaged. "Where is he?" I asked, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. "Where's Henry?" The photographer tilted his head, a gesture that managed to be both curious and predatory. When he spoke, his voice carried no inflection whatsoever. "Who?" "The man who's been here every night, the veteran, my friend. There's never been anyone here but you." He adjusted his grip on the camera, the movement causing shadows to shift across his unremarkable features. "Every night for 8 months, just you, sitting alone, talking to yourself, offering food to empty air." The world seemed to tilt slightly, reality sliding sideways like a photograph coming loose from its frame. "That's not... I have pictures." "Show me." With trembling fingers, I pulled out my phone and navigated to the photos from the previous night. The photographer stepped closer, maintaining his camera's focus on my face while glancing at the small screen. His expression didn't change as he viewed the images of me sharing bagels with absolutely nothing. "Impressive," he said finally. "Most people don't maintain the delusion so consistently. Usually they catch themselves after a few weeks. But 8 months of detailed conversations with an imaginary protector? That takes dedication." "He's not imaginary." But even as I said it, doubt crept into my voice like cold water filling a cracked foundation. He knows things. He warned me about you. You warned yourself about me. Your subconscious recognized the threat and created a guardian to manage your fear. The photographer lowered his camera slightly, though he continued watching me with those two bright eyes. It's actually quite beautiful, from a psychological perspective. The mind's ability to construct elaborate defense mechanisms when faced with unacceptable reality. What reality? That you've been walking alone through empty streets for months, slowly losing your grip on consensus reality. That the homeless veteran who shares your food and protects you from danger exists only in your head. That the person following you, documenting your decline, isn't some random predator. The alley felt smaller suddenly, the walls pressing inward like the city was collapsing around us. Then who are you? The photographer smiled for the first time, an expression that somehow made his unremarkable face deeply unsettling. I'm Dr. Mitchell, Coffee Girl. I've been trying to help you for months. Coffee Girl. The phrase hit me like cold water, carrying implications I wasn't ready to process. You can't be. I'm a psychiatrist at St. Mary's Hospital. You've been coming to our emergency room twice a week, reporting a homeless veteran who disappears from photographs. The staff has been monitoring your deterioration with growing concern. He gestured with his camera toward the empty alley. This is intervention, not predation. But the pictures, I whispered, holding up my phone like a talisman. He's not in any of the pictures. Because he was never there. Mental constructs don't photograph, no matter how real they seem to the person experiencing them. Dr. Mitchell's voice carried what might have been compassion, though it was difficult to tell through the clinical detachment. The question now is whether you're ready to accept help, or if you need us to pursue involuntary commitment. The world became very quiet. Even the city's ambient noise, traffic, air conditioning, electrical hum, seemed to fade into background static. I looked at the empty concrete where Henry should have been sitting, where his cardboard sign should have been propped against the wall, where traces of our shared meals should have littered the ground. Nothing. No evidence that anyone except me had ever occupied this space. The coffee smell, I said desperately. He always said I smelled like coffee. You work at a coffee shop downtown. The scent clings to your clothes even after your shift ends. Dr. Mitchell raised his camera again, the mechanical whir resuming its steady rhythm. I've been documenting your nightly visits here for my research, chronicling the progression of your condition. Research? Sleep deprivation psychosis with protective hallucinations. It's rare to observe in such detail. The camera clicked several times in rapid succession. You've created an elaborate narrative to explain your isolation and fear, complete with a guardian figure who conveniently appears whenever you feel threatened. I looked at my phone again, scrolling through weeks of photographs that showed me alone in various locations throughout the city, sitting by myself outside closed storefronts, talking animatedly to empty doorways, offering food to nothing but shadow and air. How many people had seen me? How many had watched me having detailed conversations with someone who existed only in my increasingly fractured mind? The insomnia started it, Dr. Mitchell continued, his voice taking on the rhythm of practiced explanation. Chronic sleep deprivation causes hallucinations, paranoia, breaks from reality. Your brain, desperate for rest and increasingly unable to distinguish between waking and dreaming states, began manufacturing experiences to fill the gaps. But he felt so real. My voice sounded small in the narrow alley, like a child's plea for understanding. We talked about everything. He had opinions about the weather, stories about his military service, preferences for different types of bagels. All products of your imagination, drawing from things you'd observed or read about. Your mind created a detailed character because you needed protection, needed companionship, needed someone to share your burden. The camera's whirring grew more insistent. The human psyche is remarkably creative when it comes to self-preservation. I stared at the empty space where Henry should have been, trying to summon some trace of his presence. But the alley remained stubbornly vacant, offering no evidence of our months of shared meals and quiet conversation. The brick wall bore no impression of his body. The ground showed no wear patterns from his nightly presence. "How long?" I asked. "Since the beginning. Every night for 8 months you've been visiting this empty alley and having conversations with no one." Dr. Mitchell lowered his camera, studying me with professional interest. "The staff at St. Mary's has been tracking your deterioration through your emergency room visits. Initially, you seemed merely sleep-deprived and anxious. But as the hallucinations became more elaborate, more detailed, we realized intervention was necessary. The photographs on my phone told their own story, a gradual progression from tired-looking selfies to images of me clearly engaged with invisible companions. In the earliest shots, I appeared to be merely resting in various locations. But as the weeks passed, the photos showed increasingly animated interactions with empty space. My expressions ranging from laughter to deep concentration to obvious distress. "The bagels," I said weakly. "Someone's been eating the bagels." "You've been eating them yourself, probably without realizing it." Dissociative episodes often involve actions performed without conscious awareness. Dr. Mitchell gestured toward the dumpster behind the bagel shop. "Marcus has been concerned about you for weeks, watching you take food and then stand in the alley talking to yourself while eating both portions." The revelation hit me like physical force, doubling me over with its implications. Months of carefully constructed reality crumbled in the space between one breath and the next. Henry, my protector, my friend, my anchor to something resembling human connection, had never existed outside my own desperate need for companionship. "What happens now?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know. "Now we get you help. Medication to address the sleep disorder and stabilize your brain chemistry. Therapy to process the underlying issues that created this elaborate coping mechanism." Dr. Mitchell's expression softened slightly, approaching something that might have been kindness. "You're not beyond help. This is treatable, manageable, but it requires acknowledging that what you've been experiencing isn't real." I looked around the alley one more time, searching for some trace of Henry's presence, some evidence that our shared hours hadn't been elaborate self-deception. The brick walls remained silent. The concrete offered no comfort. Even the scattered newspapers I'd attributed to Henry's presence now seemed like ordinary urban debris, blown into place by wind and coincidence. "Coffee girl," Dr. Mitchell said gently, using Henry's name for me. "Are you ready to come with me?" The nickname felt different in his mouth, clinical rather than affectionate, a label rather than an endearment. But it carried the same recognition, the same sense of being seen and known. Perhaps that recognition had always come from within myself, my exhausted mind creating external validation for my existence. I nodded slowly, pocketing my phone and its gallery of conversations with no one. The mechanical whir of Dr. Mitchell's camera continued as he documented this final moment, adding it to his research on the elaborate lengths the human psyche will pursue to protect itself from unbearable isolation. As we walked toward the mouth of the alley, I caught a whiff of something familiar in the air. Fresh coffee, strong and bitter and somehow comforting. For just a moment I thought I heard Henry's voice in the wind, calling me coffee girl one last time. But when I turned around, the alley was empty. It had always been empty. The camera clicked once more, capturing my backward glance, preserving this moment of final recognition for whatever purpose Dr. Mitchell's research might serve. Then we emerged onto the street, leaving behind the space where my protection had lived and died in the span of 8 months of sleepless nights. Somewhere in the distance, a streetlight flickered in what might have been Morse code, or might have been simple electrical failure. The city breathed its pre-dawn sigh, preparing for another day of hiding its true face behind familiar surfaces. And I walked away from the alley, no longer certain whether the coffee smell that followed me was real, or just another kindness my fractured mind had learned to provide for itself. The question would haunt me for years to come, not whether Henry had been real, but whether it mattered. Protection, after all, works best when you don't understand exactly how, even when it comes from places cameras can't see. Story 5. The sound started 3 nights ago. A thin, desperate mewing that seemed to seep through the walls of our ranch house like moisture through old wood. I've checked every room, every closet, every crawl space beneath the floorboards. There are no cats here anymore. Sarah noticed it first. My half-sister has always had better hearing than me, probably from years of working the early shift at Henderson's Market, where the refrigeration units hum at frequencies that would drive most people insane. She mentioned it casually over coffee, her fingers drumming against the ceramic mug in that nervous rhythm she'd developed since the troubles started. "Do you hear that?" she'd asked, tilting her head toward the kitchen wall. I'd listened, straining against the familiar symphony of our aging house. The settling beams, the whisper of wind through the eaves, the distant hum of the generator. Nothing unusual, but Sarah's expression had tightened, her green eyes focusing on something I couldn't detect. The troubles had begun 2 months earlier, though I suppose they'd been building longer than that. It's hard to pinpoint exactly when Carl Brennan's interest in Sarah shifted from the casual attention of a regular customer to something more persistent, more unsettling. Sarah worked the deli counter at Henderson's, slicing meats and arranging cheese displays with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd found peace in routine. Carl came in twice a week for his usual order, a pound of honey ham sliced thin, and a half-pound of Swiss cheese. At first, Sarah mentioned him only in passing. The guy who always came in on Tuesdays and Fridays, who lingered a bit too long at the counter, who asked too many questions about her schedule. Then the visits became more frequent, daily, sometimes twice a day. He'd buy small items, a single apple, a pack of gum, just to have an excuse to approach her station. When Sarah finally asked her manager to have someone else handle Carl's orders, the man had shown up at our ranch. Our property sits on 12 acres of scrubland outside Millfield, Texas, far enough from town that the nearest neighbor is a quarter-mile away. It's the kind of isolation that usually brings peace, but lately, it feels more like vulnerability. The house belonged to our father before he passed, and Sarah and I had decided to keep it rather than sell. Neither of us had anywhere else to go, really. Different mothers, same wandering father, both of us left to figure out family on our own terms. The first sign of Carl's presence was the collar. I'd found it hanging from the fence post near our mailbox, a bright red leather collar with silver studs. It looked expensive, like something you'd buy for a show dog, not the kind of thing you'd expect to find discarded on a ranch road. Sarah had gone pale when I showed it to her, recognizing it immediately as similar to ones Carl had described seeing in pet stores around town. He'd mentioned during one of his extended conversations that he was thinking about getting a dog, maybe something to keep him company in his apartment above the hardware store. When I suggested we report it to Sheriff Dawson, Sarah had shaken her head quickly. She didn't want to make a big deal out of what might be nothing. Carl hadn't actually done anything threatening, she reasoned. Maybe the collar had fallen from someone's truck. Maybe it was completely unrelated. But then we found the second one, this time tied to the gate leading to our back pasture, and the third, hanging from a tree branch near our water well. Each collar was different colors, different styles, but they all shared one disturbing characteristic. They reeked of something chemical, something that made our eyes water and sent our cats slinking away with flattened ears. Mittens had been the first to disappear. Our gray tabby, who'd been with us for 3 years, had always been an outdoor cat, roaming the property with the confidence of a small apex predator. One morning, he simply wasn't there for breakfast. No body, no signs of struggle, just absence where presence used to be. Within a week, our other 2 cats, Duchess and Tom, had vanished as well. The ranch felt different without them, their absence creating a hollow quality to the soundscape. No more purring on the porch, no more claws clicking against the wooden floors, no more gentle protests when we moved them from comfortable sleeping spots. That's when I'd installed the trail cameras. The hardware store in town sold hunting cameras designed to capture wildlife movement, motion-activated devices that local ranchers use to monitor deer populations and identify problem predators. I'd set up 3 of them around our property, One near the mailbox, one by the back gate, and one overlooking the area where we'd found most of the collars. The cameras recorded for 2 weeks without capturing anything more interesting than the occasional raccoon or armadillo. I'd begun to think that maybe Carl had lost interest, that maybe the collars had been some kind of bizarre coincidence. Sarah had started sleeping better, the tension in her shoulders beginning to ease. Then came the night that changed everything. I'd checked the cameras on a Thursday morning, downloading the SD cards to my laptop as part of my weekly routine. The first 2 cameras showed the usual collection of small wildlife, but the third camera, the one positioned near our back pasture, had captured something that made my coffee go cold in my mouth. At 3:17 a.m., a figure had appeared in the frame, tall, wearing dark clothes, moving with the careful deliberation of someone who didn't want to be seen. The image quality was grainy, but the silhouette was unmistakably human. The figure had carried a shovel, and over the course of 17 minutes, I watched him dig a hole near the fence line, place something inside, and then carefully cover it again. I'd grabbed a flashlight and hurried outside, Sarah following despite my protests. The ground where the camera had recorded the digging was disturbed, no question about it. Fresh dirt, a slight depression in the earth. But when we dug down with our own shovels, we found nothing. The hole was empty, the soil loose and dark, smelling of something organic and unpleasant. That had been 6 days ago. Since then, the property had felt different, charged with a tension that made the air itself seem thicker. Sarah had taken to checking the locks on all the doors twice before bed, and I'd found myself listening to every sound the house made, cataloging each creak and whisper as either familiar or potentially threatening. And then the meowing had started. The first night, I'd convinced myself it was coming from outside. Maybe a stray cat that had wandered onto the property, drawn by some lingering scent from our missing pets. I'd spent an hour with a flashlight, searching the areas around the house, calling softly and listening for responses. Nothing. The second night, the sound had seemed closer, more distinct. It came in short bursts, 3 or 4 plaintive cries followed by long periods of silence. Sarah had heard it too this time, and we'd searched the house together, checking closets, looking under furniture, even climbing into the cramped attic space. The sounds had stopped the moment we started actively looking. Now, on the third night, the meowing was undeniably coming from inside the walls themselves. I'd pressed my ear against the drywall in different rooms, trying to pinpoint the source. In the kitchen, the sound seemed to come from behind the refrigerator. In the living room, it emanated from somewhere near the fireplace. In our bedrooms, it whispered from behind the headboards, but it was always just out of reach, always just beyond the next wall. Sarah had stopped eating regularly. I'd find her standing in doorways, head tilted, listening to sounds I couldn't hear. When I asked her about it, she'd shake her head and claim she was fine, but her eyes held a glassy quality that reminded me of someone running a fever. "It's Mittens," she'd said the previous evening, her voice barely above a whisper. "I know his voice. He's trying to tell us something." I'd wanted to argue, to point out the impossibility of what she was suggesting, but the certainty in her voice had stopped me. Sarah wasn't prone to flights of imagination. She was practical, grounded, the kind of person who balanced checkbooks and remembered to change the oil in her car. If she believed she was hearing our missing cat, something was seriously wrong, either with the situation or with us. Tonight, the sounds were more frequent, more urgent. They came from different directions, sometimes simultaneously, as if multiple cats were calling from various points within the walls. The meowing had taken on an almost conversational quality, with pauses that seemed to invite responses, inflections that suggested questions being asked. I'd tried recording the sounds with my phone, but the playback revealed only the ambient noise of the house. No meowing, no cat voices. Nothing but the familiar soundtrack of settling wood and distant wind. Either the microphone wasn't sensitive enough to pick up whatever we were hearing, or we were hearing things that weren't really there. The thought had been circling my mind for days, growing stronger with each inexplicable sound. Maybe the stress of Carl's harassment, combined with the loss of our cats and the disturbing footage from the trail camera, had triggered some kind of shared psychological break. Maybe Sarah and I were feeding off each other's anxiety, creating auditory hallucinations that felt real because we both desperately wanted our cats to be alive, to be recoverable. But then why did the sounds seem to respond to us? Earlier this evening, I'd experimented with calling Mitten's name softly. The meowing had intensified immediately, becoming more urgent, more focused. When I'd moved toward the kitchen, the sounds had seemed to pull away, leading me deeper into the house. When I'd stopped, they'd stopped too, as if waiting for me to catch up. Sarah had noticed the pattern as well. She'd begun following the sounds through the house like someone navigating by audio compass, her movements becoming more fluid and confident as the evening progressed. Watching her, I'd felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. The meowing was getting louder now, more insistent. It seemed to be coming from the basement, though we'd checked down there multiple times. The sound echoed strangely in the confined space, bouncing off concrete walls and creating harmonics that made it difficult to determine the actual source. I'd noticed something else tonight. The trail camera positioned near the back gate had been moved. Not dramatically, but enough that its field of view was now focused on the house, rather than the pasture. I'd checked the SD card, but there was no footage of anyone adjusting the camera. It was as if the device had repositioned itself. Sarah was standing by the basement door now, her hand resting on the knob. She'd been there for nearly 10 minutes, listening to sounds that seemed to be growing stronger, more complex. The meowing had developed layers, high, plaintive cries overlaid with deeper, more guttural sounds that didn't quite sound like any cat I'd ever heard. "They're down there," she said without turning around. "They're all down there, and they're scared." I wanted to tell her that cats don't survive for weeks without food and water, that whatever we were hearing couldn't be our missing pets. I wanted to suggest that we call someone, a doctor maybe, or at least Sheriff Dawson. But the sounds were so convincing, so desperate and familiar, that part of me was beginning to believe that maybe impossible things were possible, that maybe Carl Brennan had done something beyond simple harassment, something that defied rational explanation. The basement door opened with its familiar creak, and Sarah began descending the wooden steps. The meowing intensified immediately, coming from every direction at once, a chorus of feline voices that seemed to welcome her approach. I followed, my flashlight beam dancing across the familiar landscape of storage boxes and forgotten furniture. The sounds were overwhelming down here, echoing off the concrete walls with an intensity that made my ears ring, but as I swept the flashlight beam across the basement, I saw nothing. No cats. No hiding places where cats could be concealed. No evidence of any living thing other than the two of us. Sarah had stopped in the center of the basement, her head tilted back, listening to something above us. The meowing was definitely coming from overhead now, from the space between the basement ceiling and the first floor. But we'd crawled through that area just yesterday, searching for any sign of our missing pets. There was nothing up there but insulation and spider webs. "Do you hear them calling our names?" Sarah asked, her voice dreamy and distant. I listened carefully, straining to make sense of the cacophony of sounds surrounding us. The meowing did seem to have patterns, rhythms that might be interpreted as attempts at communication. But names? I couldn't make out anything that specific. "Sarah," I said carefully, "I think we should go back upstairs." She turned to look at me, and in the flashlight beam, her eyes reflected light like an animal's. For just a moment, she looked like something else, something that wasn't quite my sister. The meowing stopped abruptly, leaving us in complete silence. The absence of sound was more unsettling than the cacophony had been, creating a pressure in my ears that made me feel disoriented. Sarah continued to stare at me, her reflected gaze unblinking. Then, from somewhere very close, maybe from Sarah herself, came a single soft meow. Outside, I could hear the sound of a shovel biting into earth. Story 6. The old house breathed differently at night. Every creak of its weathered bones seemed deliberate, calculated, as if the structure itself harbored intentions beyond mere settling. I'd been staying here for 3 weeks now, house-sitting for my uncle while he recovered from surgery in the city, and I still couldn't shake the feeling that the place was watching me, testing me. My cigarettes waited upstairs in the attic, a habit I'd hidden from my uncle, relegated to the furthest corner of his domain where the smell couldn't seep into the living spaces below. The wooden steps groaned their familiar protest as I climbed, phone's flashlight cutting a pale wedge through the darkness. These midnight excursions had become ritual, a necessary escape from the suffocating quiet that settled over the house after 10 p.m. The attic door stood slightly ajar, though I distinctly remembered closing it earlier. The gap was barely visible, just a sliver of deeper black against the already dim hallway. But it sent an odd chill down my spine. Houses settle, doors shift. I repeated this mantra as I pushed the door wider, the hinges releasing their rusty sigh into the stillness. My phone's light swept across the familiar chaos of stored memories, cardboard boxes labeled in my uncle's careful script, an antique rocking chair draped in dust sheets, Christmas decorations that hadn't seen daylight in years. The air hung thick with the mustiness of age and neglect, carrying undertones of something else. Something organic and faintly sweet that I'd never noticed before. I made my way toward my usual spot near the far window, where a gap between stacked boxes created a makeshift smoking nook. The floorboards felt different beneath my feet tonight, softer somehow, as if the wood had absorbed too much moisture from the recent rains. Each step produced a sound that seemed to echo longer than it should in the cramped space, bouncing off the slanted ceiling and returning as something almost but not quite identical. That's when I saw it. A shadow moved across the wall to my left, a shadow that shouldn't exist. My phone's beam was the only light source, casting my own silhouette in the opposite direction. Yet this other shadow drifted along the wooden planks with fluid independence. It had my general shape, my height, the way I held my shoulders slightly hunched from years of desk work. But it moved wrong. Too smooth, too deliberate. I froze, watching as the shadow rounded the corner where the roofline met the floor, disappearing into a space that couldn't accommodate anything larger than a mouse. The physics made no sense. The ceiling there sloped so sharply that even a child would have to crawl, yet the shadow had maintained human proportions as it vanished. My name echoed from somewhere below, distant and muffled. Marcus's voice calling from the first floor. But Marcus had left hours ago, right after dinner. I'd watched him drive away, his taillights disappearing down the gravel road that led back to town. The memory felt solid, real, but doubt began to gnaw at its edges like water-eroding stone. The cigarette pack crinkled in my trembling fingers as I fumbled for a lighter, desperate for the familiar ritual to ground me in something tangible. The small flame bloomed in the darkness, casting dancing orange light across the attic's contents. Everything looked normal in the flickering glow. Too normal, as if the space were trying too hard to convince me of its innocence. I took a long drag, holding the smoke in my lungs until they burned, then exhaled slowly into the stagnant air. The nicotine should have calmed my nerves, but instead it seemed to sharpen my senses, making me hyper-aware of every sound, every subtle shift in the shadows that surrounded me. The attic felt smaller than usual, the walls pressing inward with each passing second. Another call from below, clearer this time. Definitely Marcus, definitely saying my name. But how could that be possible? Had he returned? Had he never left? The uncertainty clawed at my mind, unraveling the careful logic I'd built around the evening's events. Memory felt suddenly unreliable, like trying to hold water in cupped hands. I moved closer to the spot where the shadow had disappeared, crouching to examine the junction of wall and floor. The wood here was different, darker, almost black in places, with a texture that seemed to shift under my phone's light. When I reached out to touch it, my fingers met not solid timber but something yielding, slightly warm, that recoiled at my contact. The cigarette fell from my lips, the ember hissing as it hit the floor. In the sudden darkness that followed, I heard it, a sound like fabric dragging across wood, slow and deliberate, coming from the impossible space where the shadow had vanished. Something was in there, something that shouldn't fit, shouldn't exist in a gap barely wide enough for storage. I scrambled backward, sweeping my phone's light frantically across the attic. Everything appeared normal again, boxes and furniture occupying their proper places. But the normalcy felt like a mask poorly fitted over something fundamentally wrong. The dragging sound continued, growing fainter but never quite stopping, as if whatever made it was retreating deeper into the house's hidden spaces. Marcus called again, his voice carrying a note of concern that made my chest tighten. 3 times now, each call more insistent than the last. But if he was really downstairs, why hadn't I heard his car return? Why hadn't the front door announced his arrival with its characteristic slam? The questions multiplied like bacteria in my mind, each one spawning 2 more doubts. I stood on unsteady legs, every instinct screaming at me to flee the attic, to race downstairs and confirm that Marcus was real, that I wasn't losing my grip on reality. But another part of me, a deeper, more primitive part, whispered warnings about what I might find waiting below. What if the voice wasn't Marcus at all? What if it was something else? Something that had learned to mimic his tone, his inflection, his way of shortening my name when he was worried. The floorboards groaned behind me, a sound too heavy and deliberate to be explained by the house's natural settling. I spun around, phone light sweeping across empty space, but the sound had already stopped. Silence pressed against my eardrums like deep water, broken only by the distant repetition of my name from somewhere in the house's depths. I began to back toward the attic door, keeping my light trained on the space where the shadow had disappeared. The darkness there seemed thicker now, more substantial, as if it were absorbing the phone's beam rather than being illuminated by it. Step by step, I retreated, fighting the growing certainty that something was watching me from within that impossible gap. The hallway felt like a sanctuary after the oppressive atmosphere of the attic, but the relief was short-lived. As I pulled the door closed behind me, I caught a glimpse of movement in my peripheral vision. Another shadow, this one human-sized and distinctly shaped, gliding down the corridor ahead of me. It moved without sound, without the subtle disturbances that should accompany a physical presence. No floorboard complaints, no whisper of clothing against skin. My heart hammered against my ribs as I followed the shadow's path with my light. But the hallway stretched empty before me. The beam revealed nothing but faded wallpaper and worn carpet, innocuous details that seemed to mock my growing terror. Yet I could feel it still, a presence that shouldn't exist, moving through the house with purposeful intent. The voice called again, closer now, definitely coming from the first floor. But there was something different about it this time, a subtle wrongness that I couldn't quite identify. The cadence was right, the pronunciation perfect, but it felt hollow somehow, like an echo of an echo, a recording played through speakers that couldn't quite capture the full range of human warmth. I descended the stairs slowly, each step a small act of courage in the face of mounting dread. The living room lay in darkness below, familiar shapes rendered alien by shadow and uncertainty. My phone's light picked out details one by one. The leather armchair where Marcus had sat earlier, the coffee table still bearing the rings from our beer bottles, the television's black screen reflecting my approach like a dead eye. But the room was empty. No Marcus. No sign that anyone had been here since I'd climbed to the attic. The front door remained locked, deadbolt engaged, security chain in place. The windows showed no disturbance, their frames sealed against the night. If Marcus had returned, he would have needed to materialize rather than enter. I called his name, my voice cracking slightly on the second syllable. No response came from the house's depths, but something else answered. A sound like footsteps directly overhead, pacing back and forth across the attic floor. Slow, measured steps that seemed to mirror my own movements from minutes before. Each footfall landed with deliberate precision, as if whatever made them was learning to walk like me. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees, raising goosebumps along my arms despite the house's generally stuffy atmosphere. My breath misted slightly in the phone's light, a phenomenon that should have been impossible in the humid summer air. The house itself seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I moved through the first floor methodically, checking every room, every closet, every space large enough to conceal a human form. The kitchen stood empty, dishes drying in the rack where I'd left them. The guest bathroom showed no signs of recent use. My uncle's study remained locked, key hanging on its familiar hook beside the door, yet the footsteps continued overhead, maintaining their steady rhythm like a heartbeat in the house's wooden skeleton. As I stood in the darkened living room, phone light dancing across the ceiling as I tracked the sounds above, a new understanding began to crystallize in my mind. The shadow I'd seen, the one without feet that had disappeared into an impossible space, it hadn't been fleeing from me. It had been leading me away from something else, something that now walked through the attic, wearing the cadence of my movements, learning the weight of my step. The voice called my name again, but this time it came from above, from the attic. The same voice that had supposedly been summoning me from below, now emanating from the exact space I'd just fled. The impossibility of it made my knees weak, my grip on rational explanation slipping like sand through fingers. But it wasn't quite right, this overhead voice. Close enough to pass casual inspection, but missing some essential quality that made Marcus's speech distinctly his. Like a photograph that captures every detail except the subject's soul, this imitation carried all the surface elements while lacking the deeper resonance of authentic humanity. I found myself climbing the stairs again, drawn by a compulsion I couldn't fully understand. Each step felt like moving through thick honey, my body fighting against my mind's commands. The attic door stood open once more, though I distinctly remembered closing it. The darkness beyond seemed to pulse with malevolent life, breathing in rhythm with something that might have been laughter. The calling stopped as I reached the threshold. Silence reclaimed the house with sudden totality, as if someone had thrown a switch that controlled all sound. Even my own breathing seemed muffled, absorbed by the expectant quiet that pressed against me from all sides. I raised my phone, its light cutting through the darkness to reveal the attic exactly as I'd left it. Boxes, furniture, the gap where the shadow had vanished. But something was different now. The space felt charged, electric with possibility and dread. The air itself seemed to vibrate at a frequency just below human perception. In the far corner, where the roofline created that impossible space, something gleamed. Not reflected light, but a soft phosphorescence that seemed to emanate from within whatever cast it. I approached slowly, each step an act of will against every survival instinct screaming at me to run. The glow came from a figure crouched in the narrow gap, folded impossibly small, yet maintaining human proportions. It faced away from me, showing only the curve of a familiar back, shoulders I recognized from years of friendship. But where feet should have been, the figure simply faded into shadow, dissolving into the darkness as if only partially materialized. It began to turn, movement slow and deliberate, and I realized with crystalline horror that I was about to see my own face looking back at me. Not Marcus, not some unknown intruder, but myself, or something wearing my appearance with the same hollow authenticity as the voice that had called my name. I stumbled backward, phone clattering to the floor, its light spinning wildly before settling at an angle that cast my shadow enormous against the opposite wall. For a moment, the shadow moved independently, reaching toward the figure in the corner with desperate hunger before snapping back to match my own movements. When I retrieved the phone, hands shaking so violently I could barely maintain my grip, the corner stood empty. No glow, no figure, no sign that anything had ever been there. But the wood in that space showed fresh scratches, as if something had recently clawed its way deeper into the house's hidden recesses. I fled then, abandoning any pretense of investigation or rational thought, down the stairs, through the living room, to the front door where my fingers fumbled with locks that seemed determined to keep me trapped inside. The night air hit my face like a blessing when I finally escaped, cool and clean after the attic's oppressive atmosphere. But even standing in the safety of the yard, I could see movement in the attic window. A pale shape that might have been a face, watching my retreat with patient interest. The figure raised what might have been a hand in farewell, a gesture so perfectly mirrored to my own unconscious wave that I snatched my arm back to my side with a gasp. I drove to town that night, renting a motel room and calling in sick to work the next day. When I finally returned to my uncle's house 36 hours later, bringing a friend for moral support, everything appeared normal. The attic showed no signs of disturbance, no scratches in the corner wood, no trace of the phosphorescent glow I'd witnessed. Marcus confirmed he'd left after dinner, had gone straight home, had never called my name or returned to the house. His confusion at my questions seemed genuine, unmarked by the hollow quality I'd detected in that impossible voice. We spent the evening drinking beer and laughing about old times, but I found myself watching his shadow carefully, noting how it moved in perfect synchronization with his body. I finished my house-sitting duties without incident, though I never returned to the attic for my cigarettes. When my uncle came home, he mentioned finding a pack in the kitchen trash, half empty and seemingly abandoned. He seemed puzzled by this waste, but didn't press for explanations I couldn't provide. Sometimes, in my own apartment months later, I catch my reflection moving just slightly out of sync with my motions. A fraction of a second delay, barely perceptible, as if the mirror world operates on a different timeline. These moments pass quickly, easily dismissed as tricks of light or fatigue. But they leave me wondering about the nature of identity, about what parts of ourselves we might unknowingly leave behind in dark places. I've never told anyone the complete truth about that night. How could I explain the impossible geometry of shadows, the voice that belonged to someone who wasn't there, the figure that wore my shape while lacking my substance? The rational mind rejects such testimony, files it under stress or sleep deprivation, or the kind of temporary break that can happen to anyone under the right circumstances. But late at night, when darkness settles over my apartment like a familiar blanket, I sometimes hear my name called from empty rooms. The voice is always almost right, nearly perfect in its imitation, missing only that essential quality that makes it truly mine. And I wonder if somewhere, in an attic or basement or hidden space between walls, something continues to practice being me, growing more convincing with each attempt, waiting for the moment when the imitation becomes perfect enough to step into the light. Story 7. The first time it happened, I thought it was sleep paralysis. Lying on my side in the darkness, I felt the mattress dip behind me, a slow, deliberate depression, as if someone had carefully lowered themselves onto the bed. The springs didn't creak. They simply yielded, accepting this new weight with the kind of resignation that comes from years of bearing burdens. Then came the arm, sliding around my waist with the certainty of a lover who had done this 1,000 times before. But the skin was wrong. Too cold, too smooth, like marble that had been stored in a morgue. I didn't dare move. Every muscle in my body had turned to stone, and my breathing came in shallow, controlled sips. The air carried something else now. Incense, thick and cloying, the kind they burned in old churches where the walls had absorbed decades of prayers and sorrow. Each breath brought more of it, coating the inside of my nose, my throat, my lungs, until I could taste antiquity itself. The arm tightened when I tried to breathe deeper, a silent warning that made my ribs ache. That was 3 weeks ago. Now I know better than to fight it. The apartment came furnished, which should have been my first red flag. Who leaves behind a perfectly good mattress, a mahogany dresser that looked like it belonged in a Victorian mansion, and curtains so heavy they blocked out the sun even at noon? The landlord, Mrs. Chen, had been eager to rent it, almost desperate. She'd quoted a price so low I'd immediately asked what was wrong with the place. Previous tenant moved out suddenly, she'd said, not meeting my eyes. Left everything behind, said he couldn't take the furniture where he was going. I'd assumed he'd moved across the country, or maybe out of the country entirely. It made sense, the kind of life changes that require starting completely fresh. I understood that impulse. What I didn't understand was why someone would abandon such beautiful furniture. The bed frame was solid wood, carved with intricate patterns that seemed to shift when I looked at them too long. Vines and thorns and faces that weren't quite faces. all flowing together in a design that hurt to follow. The mattress was the most comfortable I'd ever slept on, conforming to my body like it had been made specifically for me, or for someone exactly my size. The first week was bliss. I slept better than I had in years, deep and dreamless. The apartment was quiet, insulated from the city noise by those thick curtains and walls that seemed to absorb sound. I'd found myself working from home more often, reluctant to leave the cocoon of comfort I'd discovered. The second week, I started noticing the smell. It wasn't constant, just hints of it, usually in the evening when the shadows grew long and the apartment settled into its nighttime rhythm. Incense, but not the kind you bought at New Age shops. This was older, more complex. Frankincense, maybe, mixed with something else I couldn't identify. Something that made my mouth water and my stomach turn at the same time. I'd searched the apartment thoroughly, looking for the source. I'd checked every drawer, every closet, even pulled the furniture away from the walls. Nothing. The smell seemed to come from the air itself, as if the very molecules had been steeped in ancient rituals. By the third week, I'd convinced myself it was just the old building. These century-old structures held onto odors the way they held onto history. The incense was probably just echoes of previous tenants, maybe someone who'd been into meditation or religious practices. That's what I told myself right up until the first night I felt the mattress dip. The rational part of my mind cataloged every possible explanation. Sleep paralysis was the obvious one. That state between waking and sleeping where the brain played tricks, where the body remained immobilized while consciousness flickered like a dying light bulb. I'd experienced it before in college, during particularly stressful periods. The feeling of a presence in the room, the inability to move, the sensation of being watched or touched by something that wasn't there. But this felt different, more deliberate, more present. I started sleeping with the lights on, which helped for exactly 2 nights. The presence didn't seem to care about illumination. If anything, the harsh fluorescent bulb cast shadows that made the carved bed frame look even more unsettling, turning those almost faces into definite faces that watched me with carved wooden eyes. I bought new sheets, thinking maybe the previous tenant had left something in the fabric, some residue that was triggering these episodes. The Egyptian cotton I replaced them with was crisp and clean, smelling of nothing but detergent and fabric softener. The first night with the new sheets, I slept peacefully. The second night, I woke to find them soaked with the smell of incense, as if someone had been burning it directly under my nose all night long. I started keeping a journal, documenting each incident with the methodical precision of a scientist studying an unknown phenomenon. Time of occurrence, duration, intensity of the sensations, environmental factors. I measured the temperature of the room, checked for drafts, even bought an electromagnetic field detector after reading online that spirits supposedly affected electronic equipment. The data was frustratingly inconsistent. Sometimes the presence came early in the night, sometimes just before dawn. Sometimes the embrace was gentle, almost protective. Other times it felt possessive, jealous, angry when I tried to pull away or breathe too deeply. The incense smell varied too, sometimes barely perceptible, other times so strong it made my eyes water. The one constant was the coldness of the skin against mine, that marble smoothness that felt more real than my own warm flesh. I started researching the building's history, digging through city records and old newspaper archives. The structure dated back to 1887, built by a wealthy industrialist named Harrison Thorne who'd made his fortune in textiles. He'd lived here with his wife, Catherine, until her death in 1923. After that, he'd become a recluse, rarely leaving the building, spending his final years collecting religious artifacts from around the world. The newspaper article about his death mentioned the collection specifically. Mr. Thorne's apartment was found to contain an extensive array of religious items from various cultures, including rare incense burners, ceremonial vessels, and carved religious icons. The smell of exotic incense was so strong that firefighters initially suspected a smoldering fire somewhere in the building. Harrison had died in his sleep, in what the paper described as the master bedroom. According to the building's floor plans, that would be my apartment. The article included a photograph of the bedroom taken during the estate auction. I stared at it for a long time, my coffee growing cold as I tried to process what I was seeing. The bed frame was the same, those same carved patterns, those same almost faces twisted in wooden anguish. But there was something else in the photo, something that made my hands shake as I held the printed page. The bed wasn't empty. There was a depression in the mattress, a clear outline of a human form, as if someone had been lying there moments before the photograph was taken. And beside that depression, another one, smaller and more delicate. Catherine's outline. I closed the laptop and poured myself a drink, then another. The rational explanation was simple. Harrison had died a lonely man, probably had been sleeping on one side of the bed for decades, out of habit or grief or simple human inability to let go. The depression was just wear patterns in an old mattress, nothing more. But as evening approached and the apartment began its nightly transformation from sanctuary to something else entirely, rational explanations felt as thin as the air I was afraid to breathe too deeply. The embrace came earlier that night, before I'd even fully fallen asleep. I felt the weight settle behind me, the arm sliding around my waist with familiar confidence. But something was different this time. The coldness wasn't quite as severe, and there was something else, a texture, like fabric between the skin and mine. Silk, maybe, or satin, the kind of nightgown a woman might have worn in the 1920s. I held myself perfectly still, afraid that acknowledging the difference might make it worse. But my mind was racing, connecting dots I wasn't sure I wanted connected. Catherine Thorne, dead for over a century, lying in this same bed, in this same position. Had she been the one sleeping on the right side, her husband's arm around her waist, breathing in the incense from his collection night after night? The arm tightened, not in warning this time, but in what felt almost like gratitude, as if my stillness, my acceptance, was exactly what she'd been waiting for all these years. I must have fallen asleep eventually, because I woke to sunlight filtering through those heavy curtains and the lingering smell of incense mixed with something else. Perfume, faint but distinctly feminine. The kind of scent that spoke of vanity tables and crystal bottles in a time when getting dressed was a ritual involving layers and laces and careful attention to propriety. That morning I called Mrs. Chen. She answered on the first ring, as if she'd been waiting for my call. When I asked her about the previous tenant, about why he'd left so suddenly, there was a long pause on the other end of the line. "He lasted 3 months," she finally said. "Longer than most." "Most?" Another pause. "You're the 7th tenant in 2 years. They all leave the same way. Middle of the night, no notice, leaving everything behind. They say..." She trailed off. "What do they say?" "That they're not sleeping alone." I should have left that day. Should have packed my few personal belongings and found somewhere else, anywhere else to live. Instead, I found myself researching Catherine Thorne, diving deeper into archives and genealogy websites, searching for any detail about the woman who might or might not be sharing my bed. She'd been beautiful. That much was clear from the few photographs I found. Dark hair pinned in the style of her era, pale skin, eyes that seemed to look directly through the camera and into something beyond. She'd married Harrison when she was 22, had lived in this building for nearly 40 years before succumbing to what the death certificate listed as respiratory failure. The obituary mentioned her devotion to her husband, how she'd supported his collecting interests and had often assisted him in cataloging his religious artifacts. It painted a picture of a woman who'd dedicated her entire adult life to making someone else's dreams her own, who'd breathed incense-laden air for decades until her lungs simply couldn't take anymore. Had she died in this bed? Had Harrison held her as her breathing grew shallow and labored, surrounded by the smell of exotic incense that had perfumed their entire marriage? That night, I didn't resist when the presence came. I let the arm slide around me, let myself sink into the cold embrace, breathing carefully and shallowly as I'd learned to do. But this time, I whispered into the darkness. "Catherine." The arm tightened, just slightly. Not a warning this time, but an acknowledgement. "Is that you?" Silence, except for the sound of my own heartbeat and the faint rustle of fabric against fabric. But the incense smell grew stronger, more complex, and I caught another hint of that feminine perfume. I should have been terrified. Any rational person would have been running, screaming, calling priests or psychiatrists or anyone who might be able to explain what was happening. Instead, I felt something unexpected. Sympathy. How long had she been waiting? How many tenants had fled in terror before giving her a chance to explain, to communicate, to simply be acknowledged? Harrison had died decades ago, leaving her alone in this space they'd shared, trapped by habit or love, or the simple inability to let go. "I'm not afraid," I whispered, and realized it was true. The embrace loosened slightly, becoming less possessive and more grateful, as if she'd been waiting a century for someone to say those words. The next few weeks established a routine. Each night, I would lie on my side, and Catherine would join me, her arm sliding around my waist with increasing familiarity. The incense smell became comforting rather than alarming, and I found myself looking forward to the cool touch of her skin against mine. During the day, I started making small changes to the apartment. I bought flowers, white roses, the kind that might have decorated a 1920s bride's bouquet. I replaced the harsh fluorescent bulbs with softer lighting that cast warm shadows instead of harsh ones. I even bought a small incense burner and experimented with different scents until I found one that seemed to please her. Frankincense mixed with sandalwood, exotic and ancient. My friends noticed the changes in me, though they attributed them to different causes. I was sleeping better, they said. I looked more relaxed, more content. Some suggested I'd found a girlfriend I wasn't telling them about, and I didn't bother to correct them. In a way, they weren't wrong. The embraces grew more elaborate, more intimate in their innocence. Sometimes I would wake to find the blankets arranged differently, tucked around me with careful precision. Other times, I would feel cool fingers brushing hair away from my forehead, a gesture so tender it made my chest ache. I started talking to her, sharing details about my day, my work, my frustrations with the world outside these walls. I told her about my childhood, my fears, my dreams for the future. She never responded with words, but the quality of her attention was unmistakable. The way the air grew still when I spoke, the way the incense smell would intensify during emotional moments, as if she was leaning closer to hear better. One night, I woke to find something on the nightstand that hadn't been there before. A small, tarnished locket on a delicate chain. Inside was a photograph of Catherine and Harrison, young and smiling, his hand resting protectively on her shoulder. They looked happy, complete, like two people who'd found exactly what they'd been searching for. I should have questioned how a ghost could move physical objects, should have wondered about the implications of accepting jewelry from someone who'd been dead for a century. Instead, I fastened the chain around my neck and felt the metal warm against my skin. That night, the embrace was different again, warmer somehow, less desperate, as if she'd finally found what she'd been looking for too. The end came suddenly without warning. I woke one morning to silence, not just the absence of sound, but the complete absence of presence. The air felt flat, ordinary, devoid of the weight and richness that had characterized it for weeks. I called her name, waited for the familiar dip of the mattress, the cool touch of her arm around my waist. Nothing. I spent that day in a state of growing panic, convinced I'd done something wrong, somehow driven her away. I burned every type of incense I could find, rearranged the flowers, even spoke to the empty air in increasingly desperate tones. But the apartment remained stubbornly ordinary, just four walls and some old furniture. Nothing more. That evening, Mrs. Chen called. "I wanted to let you know," she said, her voice careful and measured. "We found some additional records about the previous tenants. Thought you might be interested." She didn't wait for my response before continuing. "Turns out the man who lived there before you, he didn't just move away. He was found 3 states over, in a psychiatric facility. Said he'd been living with a dead woman, claimed she'd been trying to take him with her to wherever she was going." My blood went cold. Take him with her? The doctor said it was a complete psychotic break, Delusions, hallucinations, the whole 9 yards. He's better now on medication, but he still insists it was real. Still wears this old locket he says she gave him. I touched the chain around my neck, feeling the weight of the tarnished metal against my skin. The interesting thing, Mrs. Chen continued, is that all 7 previous tenants ended up the same way. All of them claimed they'd been living with Catherine Thorne. All of them were found wearing identical lockets. All of them were eventually diagnosed with the same condition. What condition? A long pause. Shared psychotic disorder. Folie à deux. But between a living person and, well, something that wasn't supposed to be there. I'm writing this now as the sun sets and the apartment begins its nightly transformation. The air is growing heavy again, thick with the promise of incense and cold embraces. I can feel her stirring, waking from whatever realm she retreats to during the daylight hours. The rational part of my mind knows what Mrs. Chen was trying to tell me. That this is a delusion, a psychotic break triggered by something in this apartment. Gas leaks maybe, or mold, or just the power of suggestion combined with grief and isolation. That Catherine Thorne died in 1923 and has no more substance than the shadows cast by that carved bed frame. But I can feel the mattress beginning to dip behind me, the whisper of silk against cotton sheets. The air carries that familiar perfume, mixed with frankincense and sandalwood, and something else that might be the essence of longing itself. I should leave. I should pack my things and find somewhere new, somewhere without history or carved faces watching from wooden frames. I should seek help, medication, therapy, all the rational responses to an irrational situation. Instead, I'm going to close this journal and lie down on my side, facing away from the empty space that isn't empty at all. I'm going to breathe carefully and shallowly, letting the incense fill my lungs with ancient air. I'm going to accept the arm that slides around my waist, cold and smooth and real in all the ways that matter. Because maybe the others had it wrong. Maybe Catherine isn't trying to take anyone anywhere. Maybe she's just trying to find someone willing to stay. Someone who won't run when faced with the impossible reality of love that transcends death itself. The mattress is dipping now, and I can smell the perfume growing stronger. In a moment, I'll feel that familiar arm around my waist, that marble-smooth skin against mine. I'll spend another night held in an embrace that defies everything I thought I knew about life and death and the space between them. Tomorrow, I might pack my things and leave. I might seek help, find explanations, return to the ordinary world where the dead stay dead and the living sleep alone. But tonight, I'm going to close my eyes and let myself be held by someone who has been waiting far too long for someone like me. Someone fool enough or lonely enough or desperate enough to believe that some kinds of love are stronger than death, stronger than sanity, stronger than the fear of becoming another cautionary tale in Mrs. Chen's collection. The arm is sliding around me now, and the incense is so thick I can barely breathe. But I'm not fighting it anymore. I'm not fighting any of it. After all, there are worse things than madness, and there are worse things than being loved. Story 8. The first time I noticed him, he was standing beneath the flickering streetlight outside my apartment, a shadow carved from the October darkness. His silhouette remained perfectly still, while the light above stuttered between amber warmth and cold void, casting his features in an endless dance of revelation and concealment. I watched from my third-floor window, curtains barely parted, as he stood there for what felt like hours, but couldn't have been more than minutes. When I blinked, he was gone. That was 3 weeks ago. Now, as I sit in the coffee shop on campus, the bitter scent of over-roasted beans mingling with the musty smell of old textbooks and nervous sweat, I can feel his presence like static electricity before a storm. My fingers trace the rim of my mug, ceramic rough against my skin, while my eyes scan the crowded space. Students huddle over laptops, their faces illuminated by blue screens that make them look like ghosts. Steam rises from cups and mingles with the haze of an unseasonably warm day, pressing against rain-streaked windows. He's here somewhere. I know it with the same certainty that tells me when a storm is coming. That primitive instinct that makes the hair on my arms rise and my mouth go dry. The sensation crawls up my spine like cold fingers, settling at the base of my skull where it pulses in rhythm with my heartbeat. Marcus, I learned his name from old yearbooks in the library, graduated from Jefferson High 7 years before I did. 7 years. I was 11 when he walked across that stage, still worried about kickball games and whether my mom would pack the good cookies in my lunch. Yet somehow, according to the stories he's been telling anyone who'll listen, we were lovers in another life, soulmates separated by tragedy, star-crossed teenagers whose romance was cut short by fate's cruel hand. The stories started appearing on social media about a month ago, scattered posts in local community groups, comments on memorial pages for classmates who'd passed away, whispered tales in the dark corners of the internet where grief and obsession intertwine like strangled vines. Always the same narrative with slight variations. A girl who looked exactly like me, down to the small scar above my left eyebrow from a childhood fall, who had loved him completely before dying in his arms during some unnamed catastrophe. In his stories, I was Sarah. Sometimes Sarah without the H. Occasionally Sarah like the angels he would write with what I imagined was a reverent smile. The details were always precise, unnervingly so. The way I supposedly tucked my hair behind my ear when nervous, something I didn't realize I did until he described it. The small birthmark on my shoulder shaped like a crescent moon that he claimed to have kissed 1,000 times. The way I would hum tunelessly while reading, a habit I thought was entirely private. But it was his description of my bedroom that first made my blood turn to ice water in my veins. He wrote about blue walls, which was accurate, though I'd never posted photos of my room online. He mentioned the poster of the Milky Way that hung above my desk, the one I'd bought at a science museum gift shop years ago, the wooden bookshelf my grandfather built, with its slight lean to the left that I'd never bothered to fix. And then, in a comment that made my hands shake as I read it on my phone screen, he described my bed sheets. She loved those sheets, he had written. Sky blue with tiny white stars scattered across them like wishes waiting to come true. Egyptian cotton, 400 thread count. She said they felt like sleeping on clouds. I had never photographed those sheets, never mentioned them online, never even told my closest friends about them. They were a guilty pleasure. Expensive sheets I'd bought for myself during a moment of weakness in college, using money I should have spent on textbooks. They lived in my closet now, only brought out when I needed comfort, when the world felt too sharp and I needed softness against my skin. The coffee shop door chimes, and my head snaps up. A girl with auburn hair enters, but it's not him. Never him, even though I search every face that passes. He remains a shadow, a presence felt rather than seen, like heat from a fire in the next room. I pull out my laptop and try to focus on my thesis, but the words blur together on the screen. My research on trauma and memory formation feels uncomfortably relevant now. Each academic paper I read seeming to whisper questions about my own grip on reality. Could I be imagining all of this? Creating elaborate fantasies of persecution to give meaning to an otherwise ordinary life? But then my phone buzzes with a notification. It's a private message on a platform I rarely use, from an account with no profile picture and a username that's just a string of numbers. The message contains no words, only a photograph. My breath catches in my throat like a bird with broken wings. It's my bedroom window, taken from outside. The angle suggests someone standing in the old oak tree that grows beside my building, probably on the thick branch that I've always worried might break in a storm. Through the glass, illuminated by the soft glow of my desk lamp, are my sheets. The star-covered sheets that no one should know about, spread across my bed in perfect detail. The photograph is time-stamped from last night. My fingers tremble as I close the laptop and gather my things. The coffee shop suddenly feels too warm, too crowded, filled with too many strangers whose faces I haven't memorized, whose intentions I can't gauge. The familiar buzz of conversation becomes a threatening murmur, and every laugh sounds hollow and artificial. Outside, the afternoon has turned gray and heavy. pregnant with the promise of rain. The air tastes metallic, like blood or old pennies, and carries the scent of dying leaves and wet concrete. My footsteps echo strangely on the pavement, creating a rhythm that doesn't quite match my pace, as if someone else's feet are keeping time with mine. I walk quickly toward my apartment, keys already in my hand, when I notice him. Marcus stands at the corner where my street meets the main road, hands buried deep in the pockets of a dark coat that seems too heavy for the weather. His hair is longer than in the yearbook photos, unkempt and touched with premature gray at the temples. Even from a distance, I can see that his eyes are fixed on me with an intensity that makes my skin crawl. He doesn't move as I approach, doesn't acknowledge my presence beyond that unwavering stare. His lips move constantly, a silent monologue that could be prayer or madness, or something in between. As I get closer, I catch fragments of words carried on the wind. Almost time, and complete the circle, and something that sounds like my name but stretched and distorted until it becomes something else entirely. I change direction, walking past him on the opposite side of the street. He turns to follow my movement, his body rotating like a sunflower tracking the sun, but his feet remain planted on the same square of cracked sidewalk. The sensation of his gaze follows me like heat from a furnace, and I can almost feel his thoughts pressing against the back of my skull. When I reach my building, I risk a glance over my shoulder. He's gone, but the air still holds the impression of his presence, like the way a room stays warm after someone leaves. Inside my apartment, I double-check the locks and pull all the curtains closed. The familiar space feels foreign now, contaminated by the knowledge that he's been watching, cataloging every detail of my private life. I examine every corner as if seeing it for the first time, wondering what other intimate details he's collected, what other secrets he's somehow stolen from the sacred space of my solitude. That night, I don't sleep. I lie in bed listening to every sound the building makes, every whisper of wind against the windows, every distant car engine that could be him circling the block. The darkness presses against my closed eyelids like fingers, and I find myself holding my breath for long stretches, as if making noise might give away my location. Around 3 a.m, I hear it, a soft scratching against my window, like fingernails against glass. The sound is rhythmic, deliberate, almost musical in its pattern. I lie frozen, debating whether to look, whether seeing would be worse than imagining. The scratching stops. My phone lights up with another message. "The story isn't finished yet," it reads. "She never got to say goodbye." Then another. "Soon we'll be together again, and I can tell you how it really ends." And finally, "You remember, don't you? Deep down, beneath all the forgetting, you remember the taste of rain and the sound of my voice calling your name." I delete the messages immediately, but the words burn themselves into my retinas, glowing like after-images when I close my eyes. They carry a strange familiarity, as if I've heard them before in dreams I can't quite recall. Days blur together after that. I change my routines, take different routes to campus, eat at different restaurants, but he's always there, just at the edge of my vision, a constant presence that makes my skin feel too tight and my thoughts move like trapped animals. Sometimes I spot him reflected in storefront windows, always standing just behind my right shoulder. Other times, I only feel the weight of his attention, heavy and warm, like a hand pressed against my back. The rational part of my mind, the part trained in logic and research methodology, tells me this is stalking, that I should call the police, that there are systems in place to deal with exactly this situation. But what would I tell them? That a man is watching me and writing stories? That he knows details about my life that feel impossible for him to know? That he's convinced I'm the reincarnation of a dead girlfriend who might never have existed? Even I'm beginning to question what's real. The photographs of my room appear more frequently now, taken from different angles, at different times of day. My morning coffee ritual, the way I organize my books, the specific corner of my couch where I curl up to read. Each image feels like a violation, an invasion that goes deeper than just privacy. But it's the accompanying messages that truly disturb me. Do you remember how you used to read to me on rainy afternoons? Your voice was always softer in the morning, like honey poured over gravel. You promised you'd wait for me, even beyond the veil. They arrive at all hours, fragments of a love story that feels both completely foreign and disturbingly familiar. The details are too specific, too emotionally resonant to be entirely fabricated. Sometimes reading them, I feel an echo of something, not quite memory, but the shadow cast by memory. A warmth in my chest that shouldn't be there. A longing for something I've never experienced. The worst part is that I've started dreaming about her. About me. About the girl who died in his arms, whose life mirrors mine in impossible ways. In the dreams, I see myself from the outside, watching a version of me that's both identical and completely different. This other version moves through scenes I've never lived but somehow recognize. Walking hand in hand with Marcus through a forest that smells of pine and autumn. Laughing at jokes I don't remember hearing. Saying words of love that feel true even though I've never spoken them. I wake from these dreams with tears on my cheeks and the taste of someone else's memories in my mouth. 2 weeks pass. I've stopped going to classes, stopped leaving my apartment except when absolutely necessary. The university has sent concerned emails, but I can't find the words to explain what's happening without sounding completely unhinged. My thesis advisor calls repeatedly, leaving increasingly worried voicemails that I delete without listening to completely. The walls of my apartment feel thinner now, as if they're slowly dissolving, allowing his presence to seep through like water through cracking plaster. I find myself talking back to the silence, responding to conversations no one else can hear. Sometimes I catch myself humming songs I don't remember learning, melodies that feel ancient and familiar. On a Tuesday that tastes like copper and regret, I finally see him clearly. I'm grocery shopping at the 24-hour market near campus, moving through the fluorescent-lit aisles like a ghost haunting the scene of my former life. The store is nearly empty, just me and a tired cashier who looks like she'd rather be anywhere else. The bright lights make everything look artificial, like a movie set or a fever dream. He's standing at the end of the cereal aisle, no longer hiding in shadows or lurking at the edges of my vision. Just standing there, solid and real, watching me with those intense dark eyes that seem to hold secrets I should know but don't. We stare at each other across the distance of 30 feet and 7 years of separation, and for a moment, the fluorescent lights flicker like that street lamp where I first saw him. In that stuttering illumination, something shifts in his face. The obsessive intensity softens into something that might be recognition, or relief, or homecoming. He opens his mouth as if to speak, and I realize with a chill that spreads from my spine to my fingertips that I know what he's going to say. The words form in my mind a split second before he voices them, as if I'm remembering rather than hearing for the first time. I've been waiting for you to remember. The words hang in the air between us like suspended judgment. Part of me wants to run, to flee this encounter and everything it represents. But a larger part, a part that speaks in a voice that sounds like mine but feels older, deeper, whispers that running would be useless. Remember what? I ask, though my voice sounds strange in my own ears, distant and dreamy. The ending, he says, taking a step closer. The real ending. Not the one where you die, but the one where you choose to stay. The fluorescent lights continue their erratic dance, and in their flickering rhythm, I see something impossible. A flash of memory that isn't mine, a glimpse of a life I never lived but somehow experienced. Rain on windows, the warmth of familiar arms, a voice promising forever in the space between heartbeats. The light steady, and the moment passes, leaving me standing in a grocery store at 2 a.m, faced with a man who might be a stalker or a prophet or something in between. I don't understand, I whisper, but even as I say it, I wonder if that's entirely true. He smiles then, and it's the saddest expression I've ever seen, full of love and loss and infinite patience. You will, he says. The story isn't finished yet. As I stand there in the artificial light, surrounded by mundane products and the quiet hum of refrigeration units, I feel the last threads of my certainty unraveling. The boundary between what's real and what's possible blurs like watercolors in rain, and I'm no longer sure which side of that line I want to be on. Marcus turns and walks away, his footsteps echoing strangely in the empty store. I don't follow, but I don't flee either. I simply stand there, holding a basket of groceries I no longer need, wondering if the life I thought was mine has always been borrowed, and if somewhere in the space between memory and madness, there's a story waiting to be completed. The fluorescent lights flicker one more time, and in that brief darkness, I hear the sound of rain against windows that aren't there. Story 9. The first time I saw it, I convinced myself it was nothing more than shadows playing tricks in the amber glow of my bedside lamp. The apartment's heating system had been acting up for weeks, creating drafts that made the curtains dance in ways that could fool tired eyes. But even as I rationalized what I'd witnessed, something cold settled in my chest, a certainty that defied logic. It had been 3 months since the divorce papers were finalized, 3 months since I'd moved into this cramped studio on the 7th floor of a building that groaned like an old man's bones. The landlord had apologized for the poor lighting, explaining that the previous tenant had removed most of the fixtures. I'd accepted it gladly. The reduced rent meant I could afford to stay in the city, even if it meant living in perpetual dusk. The figure appeared on a Tuesday night, materializing from the corner where the ceiling met the wall like smoke seeping through invisible cracks. At first, it was barely more substantial than breath on cold air, a wispy disturbance that made my eyes water when I tried to focus on it. But it moved with purpose, drifting toward the foot of my bed with deliberate slowness, as if testing the resistance of reality itself. I lay frozen, my heart hammering against my ribs, while my rational mind scrambled for explanations. The building was old, built in the 1940s, and the ventilation system probably circulated dust in strange patterns. The stress of the divorce, the new job, the isolation, all of it could explain why my brain was conjuring phantoms from ordinary atmospheric disturbances. But then it stopped, right there, at the foot of my bed, hovering about 3 feet off the ground. And I could feel it watching me. Not seeing, watching. There's a difference that crawls up your spine and settles in the base of your skull like a living thing. The sensation was so intense I could taste copper in my mouth, could feel the weight of invisible eyes pressing against my skin. I closed my eyes tight, counted to 10, and when I opened them again, nothing remained but the familiar shadows cast by my alarm clock's red digits. Sleep didn't come easily that night. Every creak of the building, every whisper of wind against the windows, made me scan the room for signs of movement. I told myself I was being ridiculous, that grown men didn't cower under blankets because of tricks of light and shadow. But when morning finally broke through the grimy windows, I felt like I'd been holding my breath for hours. The second encounter happened 4 days later. I'd been working late, hunched over my laptop at the small table that served as both desk and dining surface, when the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. The hair on my arms stood up, and that familiar weight of observation pressed down on me like a physical presence. This time, I didn't look immediately. Instead, I pretended to focus on the spreadsheet glowing on my screen while using my peripheral vision to scan the room. The figure was there again, but different somehow, more coherent. The edges that had been soft and indefinite before now held their shape with greater conviction, as if whatever force animated it was learning, adapting, growing stronger. I forced myself to turn slowly, to meet it head-on with all the courage I could muster. The mist, for lack of a better word, seemed to pulse with a faint luminescence, not bright enough to illuminate anything else in the room, but distinct enough to prove I wasn't imagining things. It maintained its position at the foot of my bed, patient and still, like a sentinel keeping watch. "What do you want?" I whispered, immediately feeling foolish for speaking aloud to what was probably a stress-induced hallucination. The figure didn't respond, of course, but something in its stillness seemed to shift, as if my words had registered somehow. I stared at it for what felt like hours, neither of us moving. until exhaustion finally forced my eyes closed. When I jerked awake sometime later, my neck stiff from falling asleep at the table, the room was empty again. That's when I started researching. I spent my lunch breaks at the library, combing through books on psychology, looking for explanations that would make sense of what I was experiencing. Sleep deprivation could cause hallucinations, stress, grief. The human mind was remarkably creative when it came to processing trauma, and the divorce had certainly qualified as that. But the reading also led me down darker paths. I found myself browsing forums dedicated to paranormal experiences, reading accounts from people who claimed to have encountered similar phenomena. The descriptions were unsettlingly familiar: misty figures that appeared with increasing frequency and clarity, entities that seemed more curious than malevolent, observers that watched without threatening. I told myself these were just desperate people finding patterns where none existed, imposing meaning on random events because the alternative, accepting that some things simply couldn't be explained, was too terrifying to consider. But late at night, when the walls of my apartment seemed to close in around me, those explanations felt thin as tissue paper. The third time it appeared, I was ready. I'd positioned a small digital camera on the nightstand, angled toward the foot of the bed. If this was real, I'd have proof. If it was a breakdown, maybe having evidence of my deteriorating mental state would convince me to seek help. The figure manifested earlier that night, around 11:30. I watched it take shape with what I could only describe as growing confidence, as if the act of appearing was becoming easier with practice. The mist swirled and condensed, and for the first time, I thought I could make out something resembling features within the haze. Not quite a face, but the suggestion of one. The hollow impression of eyes, the vague outline of shoulders. My hand trembling, I reached for the camera. The soft click of the shutter seemed thunderous in the silence of the room. The figure didn't react to the sound, but I noticed something else. The camera's LCD screen remained black. Not the grainy, low-light image I'd expected, but complete darkness, as if the device couldn't detect what my eyes were seeing so clearly. I took photo after photo, each one revealing nothing but the empty space at the foot of my bed. Meanwhile, the figure continued to hover there, more solid-looking than ever before. I could see what might have been clothing now, a flowing robe or gown that moved with currents I couldn't feel. The suggestion of hands, pale and long-fingered, emerged from billowing sleeves. "Please," I found myself saying, my voice barely audible. "I don't understand what you want from me." This time I was certain something changed in its posture. The misty head tilted slightly, as if considering my words. The temperature in the room dropped even further, and my breath began to fog. Ice crystals formed on the surface of my water glass, and the windows started to cloud with condensation despite the building's stuffy atmosphere. Then, for the first time, it moved. Not the slow drift I'd observed before, but a deliberate step forward. The bed frame groaned under what should have been empty air, and I felt the mattress compress as if something with real weight had pressed down on it. I scrambled backward until my spine hit the headboard, my heart hammering so hard I thought it might burst. The figure continued its approach, each step leaving a depression in the bedding that I could see clearly, indentations that remained even after it had moved on. When it reached the side of the bed, it stopped. I could feel cold radiating from it like heat from a fire, a bone-deep chill that made my teeth chatter. This close, I could see more details that shouldn't have been possible. The suggestion of facial features was stronger now. Deep-set eyes that seemed to hold starlight, a mouth that was more absence than presence, skin that looked like moonlight filtered through water. It raised what might have been a hand, reaching toward my face with infinite slowness. I wanted to move, to run, to do anything but sit there paralyzed while this impossible thing approached. But my body wouldn't obey, locked in place by terror and fascination in equal measure. The cold touch never came. Instead, the figure paused with its hand inches from my cheek, as if respecting some invisible boundary. For a long moment, we remained like that, predator and prey, observer and observed, real and unreal. Then, gradually, it began to fade. Not disappearing all at once like before, but dissolving piece by piece, starting with the extremities and working inward until only the suggestion of eyes remained, floating in the darkness like dying stars. After that night, my behavior began to change in ways that scared me more than the apparition itself. I found myself staying awake deliberately, waiting for its arrival with a mixture of dread and anticipation that felt dangerously close to addiction. I rearranged my furniture to provide better viewing angles, cleared obstacles that might impede its movement, and even began leaving small offerings on the nightstand: a glass of water, a lit candle, an old photograph from my childhood. The rational part of my mind recognized these actions as symptoms of a complete psychological break. I was either experiencing elaborate hallucinations brought on by isolation and stress, or I'd developed some form of dissociative disorder that was causing me to lose time and create false memories. Either way, I needed professional help. But then it appeared again, clearer than ever before, and all thoughts of therapy and medication evaporated like morning mist. This time, it brought something with it. The figure manifested as usual at the foot of the bed, but now it carried what looked like a bundle of cloth in its arms. The fabric seemed to shimmer with the same ethereal quality as its bearer, and as it moved closer, I realized the bundle was moving on its own, rising and falling with a rhythm that looked disturbingly like breathing. My blood turned to ice water. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't alone anymore. It had brought something from wherever it came from, something that pulsed with its own alien life. The figure approached the bed as it had before, but instead of reaching for me, it placed the bundle gently on the mattress between us. The cloth fell away, revealing something that made my sanity crack like glass under pressure. It was a baby, but not any baby that had ever drawn breath in this world. Its skin was translucent as paper, showing veins that glowed with soft phosphorescence. Its eyes were open, but they reflected no light, dark as space between stars, holding depths that seemed to go on forever. The baby turned its head toward me and smiled. I must have screamed. I must have thrashed and fought against the paralysis that held me, because the next thing I knew, I was standing in the corner of the room, pressed against the wall like a cornered animal. The bed was empty. The figure was gone. The bundle had vanished as if it had never existed, but the impression remained burned into my retinas. That impossible child with its starlight veins and void dark eyes, smiling at me with knowledge no infant should possess. I called in sick to work the next day, and the day after that. I couldn't leave the apartment, couldn't risk being away when it returned, because I knew it would return. The visits were becoming more frequent, more intense, and each time the figure grew more solid, more real. It was learning to exist in this world, adapting to our rules of physics and perception, and it was teaching me something in return, though I wasn't sure I wanted to understand the lesson. The next encounter changed everything. I'd been sitting at my table, staring at the laptop screen without really seeing it, when the familiar cold washed over me. But this time, the figure didn't appear at the foot of the bed. Instead, it materialized directly in front of me, close enough that I could see individual droplets of condensation forming and dissolving in its misty substance. This close, there was no denying its reality. I could smell it. A scent like ozone and old rain, like the air after lightning strikes. I could hear it too. A soft susurrus like wind through tall grass, underlying its movements. Most disturbing of all, I could feel its breath against my face, cold and somehow electric, raising goosebumps along my arms. The figure reached out again, and this time I didn't pull away. Its touch was like being caressed by winter itself, a cold so intense it circled back to become almost warm. Where its fingers made contact with my skin, I felt a strange tingling, as if circulation was returning to a limb that had been asleep. And then, impossibly, I heard it speak. Not with words exactly, but with thoughts that appeared fully formed in my mind, concepts that bypassed language entirely and settled directly into my consciousness. "You see me?" it said without saying. "You see me becoming." The communication was so alien, so fundamentally different from human speech, that my brain struggled to process it. but the meaning was clear enough. This thing, whatever it was, had been learning from our encounters just as much as I had. Each time it appeared, it grew more substantial, more capable of interacting with our reality. I learn your shapes, the voice in my head continued. I learn your substance. Soon I will be as real as you. What are you? I managed to whisper, though I wasn't sure if I spoke aloud or simply thought the question. I am what watches from between. I am what waits in the spaces where your light cannot reach. I am becoming. Images flooded my mind then, visions of vast dark spaces populated by things that defied description, entities that existed in the gaps between dimensions, feeding on observation itself. They were drawn to places where reality grew thin, where the barrier between worlds was weakest. And they learned by watching, growing stronger and more substantial with each moment of focused attention. I understood then, with horrible clarity, what had been happening. By observing the figure, by giving it my attention and focus, I'd been feeding it. Every night I spent watching and waiting, every moment I dedicated to trying to understand what it was, I'd been making it more real. And now it was strong enough to cross over completely, to exist in our world as fully as any living thing. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was what it showed me next. You summoned me, it said, and suddenly I was seeing myself from its perspective. I watched my own face as I lay in bed that first night, eyes wide with fear, but also fascination. I saw myself researching, preparing, waiting for its return with an eagerness that I'd tried to deny. I saw myself making offerings, clearing paths, creating the perfect conditions for its manifestation. You called, and I came. You fed me with your sight, your fear, your longing, and now I am almost ready. Ready for what? I asked, though part of me already knew the answer. To take your place. The final revelation hit me like a physical blow. The figure wasn't trying to harm me or drive me insane. It was trying to replace me. Each encounter had been a learning experience, a chance for it to study human behavior and emotion, to understand how we moved and thought and existed in this reality. The baby it had shown me, that had been its first attempt at creation, its practice run at making something that belonged in our world. But it had been imperfect, too obviously alien to pass unnoticed. So it had gone back to studying, to learning, to becoming more human with each passing night, and I had helped it every step of the way. I pulled back from its touch, but the cold followed me, spreading through my body like infection. The figure watched my retreat with what might have been amusement, its form more solid and defined than ever before. In the lamplight, it almost looked human now. Almost, but not quite. Soon, it whispered in my mind, soon I will know enough. Soon I will be ready to walk in your world, to live your life, to be you better than you ever were. The implications crashed over me in waves. If it succeeded, if it became fully human, what would happen to me? Would I fade away like it was appearing? Would I become the observer, trapped between worlds while it lived my life? I stumbled to my feet, backing toward the door. The figure didn't follow, but I could feel its attention like a weight pressing down on my shoulders. It was confident now, patient. It no longer needed to chase me. It knew I would return. Because where else could I go? This was my apartment, my life, my reality, and it was learning to inhabit all of those things with increasing skill. I spent the next 3 days in a nearby hotel, trying to convince myself that distance would break whatever connection had formed between us. But even there, in an unfamiliar room surrounded by strangers, I could feel it waiting. The cold followed me everywhere, and in reflective surfaces, I sometimes caught glimpses of movement that shouldn't have been there. On the 4th day I returned home. I told myself I was being brave, that I was going to confront this thing and demand answers. But the truth was simpler and more pathetic. I missed it. Despite everything, despite the fear and the implications and the threat to my very existence, I craved another encounter with the only thing that had made me feel truly alive since the divorce. The apartment felt different when I opened the door. Warmer somehow, more lived in. My possessions seemed subtly rearranged, as if someone had been studying them, learning their proper placement. The smell of ozone lingered in the air, and frost still covered the windows despite the building's oppressive heat. I didn't have to wait long. As soon as darkness fell, the figure appeared, not gradually this time, but all at once, as solid and present as any human being. It stood by the window, looking out at the city lights with an expression of wonder that was entirely too human for comfort. When it turned to face me, I saw that its features had continued to solidify. The suggestions of eyes had become actual eyes, pale and luminous but unmistakably real. The hint of a mouth had gained lips and teeth, and when it smiled, the expression was perfect in its mimicry of human emotion. "I have been practicing," it said, and this time the words came from its mouth as well as its mind. The voice was rough, unused, but recognizably mine, as if it had been listening to recordings of my speech and learning to replicate the sound. "Practicing what?" I asked, though I already knew. "Being you." It moved toward me with my own gait, my own unconscious gestures and mannerisms. Somewhere in the time I'd been away, it had perfected its imitation. The only things that marked it as other were the pale luminescence of its skin and the terrible depth of its borrowed eyes. "I understand now," it continued, flexing fingers that looked increasingly like my own. "I understand loneliness. I understand loss. I understand the weight of existing in a world that no longer fits properly around you." The words cut deeper than any physical threat could have. It had learned more than just my appearance and voice. It had absorbed my emotions, my memories, my pain, and now it was offering to take all of that burden from me. "I can live your life better than you can," it said with my voice. "I can be happy in ways you have forgotten how to be. I can love and be loved without the damage that holds you back." For a moment, the offer was almost tempting. What did I have to lose, really? A job that barely paid enough to survive, an empty apartment in a building that groaned with age, a life hollowed out by divorce and disappointment. If this thing could be me without the baggage, without the scars, maybe that would be better for everyone. But then I remembered the baby, that impossible child with its starlight veins and void dark eyes. I remembered the cold touch that had left my skin tingling, the alien thoughts that had invaded my mind. Whatever this thing was offering, it came with a price I wasn't prepared to pay. "No," I said, surprised by the strength in my own voice. "This is my life. Damaged or not, it's mine." The figure's expression didn't change, but something shifted in the air around us. The temperature dropped, and the lights flickered as if responding to some invisible power surge. "You cannot stop what has already begun," it said. And now there was less of my voice in its words, more of that alien susurrus that had marked its early appearances. "I have learned enough. I have become enough. With or without your permission, I will take what I need." It stepped forward, and I felt that familiar paralysis creeping through my limbs. But this time, I fought against it. This time, I had something to fight for. "You're wrong," I said, forcing myself to move, to step back. "You've learned to copy, but you haven't learned to create. You can mimic my voice, my face, my gestures, but you'll never be more than a reflection. You'll never be real." For the first time since our encounters began, the figure hesitated. Uncertainty flickered across its borrowed features, and for a moment, it looked less solid, less sure of itself. "I am real," it insisted, but there was doubt in its voice now. "I exist. I think. I feel." "You exist because I've been feeding you," I said, growing bolder as I sensed its confusion. "You think and feel because you've been stealing pieces of my consciousness. But what happens when there's nothing left to steal? What happens when you've copied everything there is to copy?" The figure's form began to waver, its carefully constructed human appearance flickering like a bad transmission. Behind the mask of my face, I caught glimpses of something else, something vast and formless, and desperately hungry. "No," it said. and the word came out as a scream that only I could hear. I am becoming. I am real. I am... But even as it spoke, I could see it beginning to fade. The careful construction of humanity it had built was coming apart, revealing the truth underneath. It wasn't becoming human at all. It was just a reflection, a shadow cast by my own desperate need for connection, for something, anything, to break the endless monotony of isolation. The figure reached for me one last time, and this time I didn't pull away. I let its cold touch wash over me, felt the alien thoughts trying to burrow into my mind, but instead of resisting, I embraced them. I accepted them as part of myself, acknowledged them as products of my own damaged psyche rather than intrusions from some otherworldly realm. And as I did, the figure began to dissolve. Not disappearing exactly, but integrating, becoming part of me in the way that all our shadows eventually do. The cold receded, the luminescence faded, and I was left alone in my poorly lit apartment with nothing but the familiar weight of my own thoughts for company. But something had changed. The loneliness that had driven me to create an observer in the first place was still there, but it felt different now, less like an absence and more like a space waiting to be filled. The apartment looked the same, but it no longer felt like a prison. It felt like a starting point. I never saw the figure again, though sometimes, in the corner of my eye, I catch glimpses of movement that might be its echo. But I'm not afraid anymore. I understand now that the most dangerous observers aren't the ones that watch us from outside. They're the ones we create ourselves, the ones we feed with our own fears and longings and desperate need to matter to someone, even if that someone exists only in the spaces between waking and sleep. The question that haunts me now isn't whether the figure was real or imagined. The question is whether there's really a difference, and whether the answer to that question matters more than what I choose to do with whatever time I have left in this world, this life, this reality that continues to exist whether anyone is watching or not. Outside my window, the city continues its restless movement, full of people who might be observers or observed, real or reflected, human or something else entirely. And I've learned to be content with not knowing the difference, as long as I remember that the choice of who to be, damaged or whole, isolated or connected, real or imagined, has always been mine to make. The apartment is quiet now, but it's a different kind of quiet. Not the empty silence of abandonment, but the peaceful hush of a space waiting for new possibilities to unfold. And if something watches me from the shadows, if some observer lurks in the poorly lit corners of my world, I've learned not to fear it. After all, we all need someone to witness our existence, even if that someone is nothing more than a reflection of our own desperate hope that we matter, that we're seen, that we're real enough to leave some mark on the world before we fade back into the darkness from which we came. The question isn't whether we're being observed. The question is whether we're brave enough to observe ourselves with the same curious, non-threatening attention that the figure showed me, to watch our own lives unfold with fascination rather than judgment, to become our own witnesses in a world that may or may not be paying attention. And in the end, maybe that's the only reality that matters. Story 10. The meditation cushion had grown cold beneath me, though I couldn't say how long I'd been sitting there. My apartment's silence pressed against my eardrums like deep water, broken only by the distant hum of the heating unit and the occasional creak of settling wood. Outside, the October night had swallowed the city whole, leaving only scattered streetlights to puncture the darkness beyond my fifth-floor window. I'd started this nightly practice 3 months ago, after Dr. Reeves suggested it might help with the stress. The promotion at work had come with responsibilities I hadn't anticipated. Late nights, impossible deadlines, and Marcus breathing down my neck with his perpetual dissatisfaction. My boss had a way of making you feel like you were drowning, even when you thought you were swimming perfectly fine. Tonight felt different, though. The meditation had pulled me deeper than usual, past the surface thoughts about quarterly reports and performance reviews, past the familiar anxiety about tomorrow's morning meeting. My breathing had slowed until it felt like someone else was controlling my lungs, each exhale drawing me further into a space that existed somewhere between waking and sleep. That's when Marcus appeared. Not in my living room. I wasn't that far gone yet. But in that liminal space where consciousness goes when it's tired of being conscious. He stood in what looked like my office, but the walls stretched impossibly high, and shadows pooled in corners that shouldn't exist. His usual crisp business attire had been replaced by something that moved like fabric, but reflected light, like liquid metal. His voice carried the same authoritative tone I'd grown to dread during our weekly one-on-ones, but the words themselves were different. He spoke of opportunities beyond the mundane world of spreadsheets and profit margins, of abilities that could reshape reality itself, powers that would make him see me not as another expendable employee, but as something approaching an equal. The offer hung in the air between us like smoke, sweet and intoxicating. All I had to do was reach out and take what he was extending, though I couldn't quite see what it was, only that it pulsed with a warmth that seemed to seep into my bones. For a moment, I found myself leaning forward, my hand beginning to rise. Then something inside me recoiled. Maybe it was the way his smile never quite reached his eyes, or how the shadows behind him seemed to writhe with their own hunger. Maybe it was simply that anything Marcus offered had to come with strings attached. That was his nature, in dreams as much as in waking life. I pulled back, shaking my head, and spoke the word that felt like it was being torn from my throat. No. His expression shifted, disappointment melting into something colder, more calculating. The space around us began to distort, walls bending inward like the inside of a closing fist. His form started to blur at the edges, becoming less human and more suggestion, as if he were being erased by an invisible hand. That's when I jerked awake, or thought I did. My body refused to move. Every muscle had turned to stone, leaving me trapped in my meditation posture while my mind screamed for action. The paralysis was complete. I couldn't even open my eyes fully, could only peer through the narrow slits between my lashes at the familiar outline of my living room. But familiar was the wrong word now. Everything had taken on a quality that made my skin crawl, as if someone had shifted each piece of furniture just slightly to the left, rearranged the shadows to create new and unsettling patterns. The air itself felt thicker, pressing against me with an almost physical weight. Then came the sound from the window. A subtle vibration at first, so faint I thought it might be a truck passing on the street below. But it grew stronger, more insistent, until I could feel it in my bones. The glass was trembling in its frame, creating a low, resonant note that seemed to bypass my ears and speak directly to some primitive part of my brain that remembered when humans huddled in caves and feared the dark. Through my barely opened eyes, I watched the window shake with increasing violence. The streetlight outside flickered once, twice, then died completely, plunging that section of the world into absolute blackness. But the darkness didn't last. A red glow began to seep through the glass, faint at first but growing stronger with each pulse. It wasn't the steady crimson of a neon sign or the warm amber of emergency lighting. This was something organic, alive, breathing with a rhythm that matched the trembling of the window. The light seemed to probe at the edges of the frame, testing the barriers between inside and outside, between here and somewhere else. I tried to scream, to move, to do anything that might break whatever spell had frozen me in place, but my body remained locked, my voice trapped in my throat like a stone. All I could do was watch as the red illumination grew brighter, more insistent, casting my familiar living room in shades of blood and shadow. The trembling intensified. Hairline cracks appeared in the glass, spreading outward from the center like a spider's web. Each new fracture released a sound like fingernails on slate, sharp and painful and wrong. The red light pulsed through these fissures, reaching into my apartment with tendril-like fingers that seemed to taste the air. Through the crimson haze, shapes began to form on the other side of the window. Not shapes exactly, more like the suggestion of shapes. Movements that my peripheral vision could almost interpret, but that dissolved into meaningless shadow when I tried to focus on them directly. They pressed against the glass with increasing urgency, as if they were running out of time, as if this window of opportunity, literally and figuratively, was about to close forever. The paralysis began to lift gradually, sensation returning to my limbs like pins and needles after sitting too long. My fingers twitched first, then my toes, and finally I could turn my head enough to see the clock on my nightstand. 3:17 a.m. The witching hour, my grandmother would have called it, though she'd never explained why that particular time held such significance. As feeling returned to my body, so did my ability to reason. This had to be sleep paralysis. I'd read about it, knew the symptoms, the inability to move, the hallucinations, the sense of an oppressive presence. It was a well-documented phenomenon, nothing more than neurons misfiring as the brain struggled to transition between sleep states. But sleep paralysis didn't explain the cold draft that was now seeping through the cracks in the window. It didn't account for the way my breath was beginning to fog in the suddenly frigid air, or how the red light continued to pulse with mechanical regularity even as my rational mind insisted it couldn't be real. I forced myself to sit up, fighting against muscles that still felt like lead. The movement sent sharp pains through my neck and back. I'd been sitting in the same position for hours, apparently. My meditation cushion was soaked with sweat despite the growing cold in the room. The window still trembled, though less violently now. The cracks were real enough. I could see them clearly in the red glow that continued to emanate from the darkness beyond. Whatever was out there seemed to sense my movement, and the pressing shapes became more defined, more urgent in their attempts to breach the glass barrier. I stood on shaking legs and took a step toward the window, then stopped. Every instinct screamed at me to back away, to put as much distance as possible between myself and whatever lay on the other side of that fragile glass. But curiosity proved stronger than fear, as it always did. That had gotten me into trouble before, in school, at work, in relationships. But I'd never been able to resist the urge to peek behind curtains that were meant to stay closed. Another step brought me close enough to see my reflection in the cracked glass, distorted by the fractures into something that looked like a funhouse mirror version of myself. The red light played across my features, making my eyes appear sunken and my skin pale as parchment. For a moment, I didn't recognize the face staring back at me. Then something moved behind my reflection. It was subtle at first, just a shift in the darkness that suggested depth where there should have been none. But as I watched, transfixed, the movement became more pronounced. A figure was approaching from the red-lit distance, walking with measured steps toward the window. Toward me. The figure resolved into a familiar silhouette. Marcus, still wearing that strange, light-drinking outfit from my meditation vision. But this version of him moved differently, with a fluid grace that reminded me uncomfortably of a predator stalking prey. His face was clearer now, and I could see that his usual smile had been replaced by something hungry and patient. He stopped just on the other side of the glass and raised one hand, pressing his palm flat against the surface. The window stopped trembling immediately, but the cracks continued to spread outward from the point of contact. When he spoke, his voice came from everywhere and nowhere, bypassing my ears entirely and resonating inside my skull. He told me I'd made a mistake, that the offer had been genuine, and my refusal had set certain things in motion that couldn't easily be stopped. He spoke of boundaries becoming permeable, of barriers that had held for centuries beginning to weaken. My meditation, he explained, had opened something that was never meant to be opened, created a connection that existed beyond the normal rules of space and time. The red light behind him pulsed brighter, and I could see other shapes moving in that crimson distance. Lots of them, all pressing forward with the same patient hunger I saw in Marcus's transformed features. They were waiting, he told me, for the moment when the window finally gave way, when the glass barrier that separated here from there would shatter completely. But that wasn't the most terrifying part of his revelation. The most terrifying part was when he asked me why I thought he was on the other side of the window instead of standing right behind me. I spun around, my heart hammering against my ribs like a caged bird. The living room was empty, exactly as it should be. No Marcus, no strange figures. Nothing but my familiar furniture arranged in their familiar patterns. The only light came from the digital clock on my cable box and the faint glow of the streetlights outside the unbroken window. I turned back toward the glass and found it pristine. No cracks, no red light, no pressing shapes from another world. Just the normal view of the street below, complete with the functioning streetlight that bathed everything in its usual orange glow. My reflection stared back at me, pale and confused, but entirely normal. The meditation cushion sat exactly where I'd left it, dry as dust. The room temperature was perfectly comfortable. My clock read 11:43 p.m., barely an hour after I'd begun my nightly practice. I stood there for a long time, studying every inch of the window for signs of damage, searching for any evidence that what I'd experienced had been more than an unusually vivid dream. But the glass was perfect, installed probably decades ago and showing no signs of stress or age. The rational explanation was obvious. I'd fallen asleep during meditation. It happened to beginners all the time, according to every guide I'd read. The dream had incorporated elements from my waking life, including my stress about work and my complicated relationship with Marcus. Sleep paralysis had made it feel more real than it actually was. Everything could be explained by neuroscience and psychology, no supernatural intervention required. But as I finally prepared for bed, I found myself avoiding the window, and when I lay down, I positioned myself so I couldn't see the glass from my pillow. I told myself it was just residual anxiety from the dream, but part of me, the part that still remembered what it felt like to be afraid of the dark, wasn't entirely convinced. Because Marcus had been right about one thing. I had made a mistake during that meditation. I'd gone deeper than I ever had before, pushed past boundaries that might have been there for good reason. And even though the window showed no signs of damage now, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed during those lost hours. Something that made the darkness outside seem hungrier than before. Over the following days, I told myself the incident was nothing more than stress manifesting in my subconscious. I continued my meditation practice, though I was careful not to go as deep as I had that night. Work continued as normal. Marcus was his usual demanding self, showing no signs of otherworldly knowledge or supernatural abilities. The window remained intact, but I found myself checking the glass obsessively, running my fingers along the frame, searching for hairline fractures that might have been missed in the dark. I researched sleep paralysis extensively, reading medical papers and forum posts from others who'd experienced similar episodes. The symptoms matched perfectly, down to the sense of an oppressive presence and the inability to move. Yet something nagged at me, a detail that didn't quite fit the neat scientific explanation I'd constructed. In all my reading about sleep paralysis, I'd found no mention of the specific quality of light I'd seen, that organic, pulsing red glow that seemed to reach through the glass with purpose and intelligence. 3 weeks after the incident, I was working late when Marcus called me into his office for what he described as a routine check-in. But as I sat across from his desk, listening to him discuss quarterly projections and market forecasts, I noticed something that made my mouth go dry. He was wearing a tie I'd never seen before, one that seemed to shift and flow in the fluorescent office lighting like liquid metal. And when he smiled at something I'd said about client retention, the expression never quite reached his eyes. As I left his office that evening, he mentioned that he'd been having interesting dreams lately. Dreams about opportunities beyond the mundane world of business, about abilities that could reshape reality itself. Dreams, he said, with that same not-quite smile, about me. Story 11. The first time I noticed him, the bass from the bar's speakers was vibrating through my chest like a second heartbeat. I was nursing my third beer, watching condensation drip down the amber bottle when the flash caught my peripheral vision. Quick, deliberate, too bright for the dim lighting. When I turned, he was already lowering his phone, but not before I caught the glint of metal studs across the black fabric, covering the lower half of his face. The mask wasn't unusual in itself. This was 2023 after all, and plenty of people still wore them in crowded spaces. But this one was different, decorated with small silver studs arranged in a pattern I couldn't quite make out from across the room. They caught the light with each subtle movement of his head, creating tiny constellations that seemed to shift and dance. He stood near the pool tables, phone still in hand, his attention apparently focused on the game in front of him. But I knew, with the kind of certainty that settles in your gut like ice water, that he had been photographing me. I told myself I was being paranoid. The lighting was dim, the music loud, and I'd been drinking. Maybe he'd been taking a picture of something else entirely. The vintage beer signs on the wall behind me, the neon that painted everything in sick greens and blues. Maybe the flash had been from someone else's phone altogether. But when I glanced back 5 minutes later, he was gone, leaving only the memory of those glittering studs and the uncomfortable sensation that something had fundamentally shifted in the atmosphere around me. The feeling followed me home that night, a prickling awareness between my shoulder blades as I walked the 6 blocks to my apartment. The streetlights seemed dimmer than usual, casting longer shadows that stretched and contracted with each step. Every sound felt amplified, the scratch of leaves across concrete, the distant hum of traffic, the echo of my own footsteps. Twice I turned around, expecting to see that studded mask catching the light behind me. But the sidewalk remained empty. I told myself it was the alcohol, the late hour, the natural unease that comes from being alone on city streets after midnight. But when I finally reached my building and looked back one last time, I could have sworn I saw a figure standing beneath the broken streetlight at the corner, perfectly still in the pool of darkness where the illumination should have been. Sleep came fitfully that night, broken by dreams of camera flashes and silver studs that formed letters in languages I didn't recognize. I woke several times with the sensation that someone was watching me through my bedroom window, though I lived on the 4th floor and kept the blinds drawn tight. Each time I checked, there was nothing but the familiar glow of the city filtering through the slats, painting thin lines of light across my bedroom wall. 3 days passed without incident. I almost convinced myself the whole thing had been a product of too much beer and an overactive imagination. I went to work, came home, fell into my usual routines. The memory of the masked man began to fade around the edges, becoming just another strange moment in a city full of them. I started to feel foolish for the way it had unsettled me. Then came the McDonald's incident. It was a Tuesday night, or technically Wednesday morning, 3:47 a.m. according to the glowing green digits on my dashboard. I'd been working late on a project that refused to come together, and hunger had finally driven me from my apartment in search of the only food available at that hour. The drive-thru was supposed to be quick, anonymous, forgettable. Just another late-night transaction in a city that never quite slept. The ordering speaker crackled to life as I pulled up, distorting the employee's voice into something barely human. I rattled off my usual order, a quarter-pounder meal, large fries, Coke, and was told to drive around to the first window. The total came to $12.47. I had exact change ready, eager to complete the transaction and get home to my cooling apartment. But when I pulled up to the pickup window, my heart seemed to stop mid-beat. The employee handing me my bag was wearing the same studded mask I'd seen 3 nights earlier. The silver studs caught the harsh fluorescent light spilling from the restaurant's interior, creating the same dancing pattern of reflections I remembered from the bar. He was tall, thin, wearing the standard McDonald's uniform shirt, but the mask transformed him into something otherworldly, alien. "Here's your order," he said, his voice muffled by the fabric but still audible. There was something odd about his tone, too casual, too familiar, as if we were old friends meeting by chance rather than strangers conducting a simple transaction. I reached for the bag with fingers that had gone numb, my movements feeling distant and disconnected from my body. The paper was warm against my palm, reassuringly normal, but when our fingers briefly touched during the exchange, his skin felt wrong. Too cold, almost waxy. "Nice night, isn't it?" he continued, leaning slightly toward my car window. "Great weather for this time of year." I glanced at my dashboard thermometer. 4 degrees Celsius. Hardly what anyone would call nice weather, especially for someone standing outside serving food through a drive-through window at nearly 4 in the morning. But I nodded anyway, some deeply ingrained politeness overriding my growing alarm. "Yeah, sure," I managed, my voice sounding strange in my own ears. That's when I noticed his breath. In the cold air, it should have been forming normal puffs of vapor, the kind you see on any winter night. Instead, the mist that escaped around the edges of his mask seemed to hang in the air longer than it should, forming distinct shapes before slowly dissipating. At first I thought I was imagining it, but as he continued to speak, something about the late shift and how quiet it got after midnight, the vapor began to form what looked disturbingly like letters. I couldn't make out words exactly, but the shapes were too deliberate, too purposeful to be random. They hung in the space between us for just long enough to register before dissolving, leaving me wondering if I'd seen anything at all. "Drive safe," he said finally, stepping back from the window. The vapor from those words formed what might have been a symbol, or perhaps just my overworked imagination imposing meaning where none existed. I drove away without responding, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles had gone white. In my rearview mirror, I could see him standing at the window, motionless, watching my car disappear into the night. The McDonald's sign cast its golden arches across the empty parking lot, and for just a moment, I could have sworn his silhouette was still visible in the glow, standing there long after any employee should have returned to their duties. The food sat untouched on my passenger seat as I drove home, the smell of fries and grease filling my car with an aroma that should have been comforting but instead felt nauseating. Every traffic light seemed to take forever. Every shadow between streetlights felt pregnant with possibility. I found myself checking my mirrors constantly, but the roads remained empty except for the occasional taxi or delivery truck. Back in my apartment, I threw the food away without taking a single bite. The thought of eating anything that had passed through his hands made my stomach turn. I stood at my kitchen window, looking down at the street below, searching for any sign of movement in the pools of darkness between the lights. The city looked normal, quiet, sleeping, innocent, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was fundamentally wrong. I tried to rationalize what had happened. McDonald's employed all kinds of people working all kinds of shifts. Maybe he wore the mask for health reasons, or personal preference, or as some kind of fashion statement. Maybe it was a coincidence that it looked similar to the one I'd seen at the bar. Maybe the vapor from his breath had only seemed to form letters because I was tired, stressed, looking for patterns that didn't exist. But even as I tried to convince myself of these reasonable explanations, I knew I didn't believe them. The way he'd looked at me, spoken to me, there had been recognition there, familiarity. He knew who I was, just as I somehow knew that our encounter hadn't been random. Sleep was impossible that night. I lay in bed listening to every sound the building made, the settling of old wood, the hum of the heating system, the distant murmur of traffic. Every noise seemed amplified, significant, potentially threatening. I kept thinking about the vapor letters, trying to remember their exact shapes, wondering what message they might have contained. Around 6 in the morning, exhaustion finally won out over anxiety, and I drifted into an uneasy sleep. But even in my dreams, I could see those silver studs glinting in fluorescent light, could feel cold fingers brushing against mine, could watch impossibly long-lasting vapor form shapes in the frigid air. The pattern continued over the following weeks, though never quite the same way twice. I'd catch glimpses of him in crowds, always distant, always wearing that distinctive mask, always seeming to fade away the moment I tried to get a better look. At a coffee shop downtown, waiting in line behind me, his reflection visible in the window before disappearing when I turned around. Walking past my office building late one evening, his distinctive silhouette backlit by streetlights before melting into the darkness between storefronts. Each sighting was brief enough to question, ambiguous enough to doubt. Maybe it was someone else with a similar mask. Maybe my eyes were playing tricks on me. Maybe the stress of constant vigilance was causing me to see patterns where none existed. But the feeling of being watched never left me. That prickling sensation between my shoulder blades that made me constantly check over my shoulder, constantly scan crowds for familiar reflecting studs. I started taking different routes to work, varying my schedule, avoiding the bars and restaurants where I'd first encountered him. But it didn't matter. He seemed to know where I'd be before I did, appearing in my peripheral vision like a recurring nightmare made flesh. Never close enough to confront, never long enough to be certain, but always there, a constant presence lurking at the edges of my awareness. The photographs started appearing a month later. I found the first one slipped under my apartment door on a Thursday morning, printed on glossy paper that caught the hallway light. It showed me at the bar that first night, sitting alone with my beer, unaware that I was being watched. The image was taken from across the room, but the quality was surprisingly good, sharp enough to make out the expression on my face. Relaxed, unguarded, completely oblivious to the camera's presence. There was no note, no explanation, just the photograph itself. I held it with trembling hands, studying every detail, looking for clues about who might have taken it or why they would want me to have it. But aside from the timestamp in the corner, showing a date and time that matched my memory exactly, there was nothing to indicate its origin. The second photograph appeared 3 days later, this time tucked under my windshield wiper. It showed me walking home from the bar that same night, captured from behind as I passed under a streetlight. I was looking over my shoulder in the image, as if I'd sensed I was being followed, and the expression on my partially visible face was one of growing unease. The third photo was waiting on my desk at work, somehow placed there despite the building's security and my locked office. This one showed me at the McDonald's drive-thru, reaching for the bag, my face clearly visible through the car window. But what made this image particularly disturbing was what it revealed about the photographer's position. They would have had to be standing behind the employee, inside the restaurant, to capture this angle. Each photograph was technically perfect, composed with an artist's eye for shadow and light. They told a story of careful observation, patient stalking, intimate knowledge of my movements and routines. Someone was documenting my life with professional precision, creating a visual narrative of encounters I was only beginning to understand. I reported the incidents to the police, but without any direct threats or evidence of criminal activity, there was little they could do. Taking photographs in public places wasn't illegal, they explained, and even the image from inside my office could have been taken by anyone with access to the building. They suggested I vary my routines, be more aware of my surroundings, consider installing security cameras in my apartment. But I was already doing all of those things. I'd become hypervigilant, constantly scanning faces in crowds, checking reflections in shop windows, listening for footsteps that matched my pace too closely. I'd changed my phone number, my email address, even considered moving to a different apartment. But somehow, I knew it wouldn't matter. Whoever was watching me had resources, patience, and a level of dedication that suggested this wouldn't end simply because I made myself harder to find. The truth began to crystallize during my fourth encounter with the masked figure, this time at a 24-hour laundromat on the other side of town. I'd driven there specifically because it was nowhere near my usual haunts, a place I'd never been before and had chosen at random from a late-night internet search. But when I walked in with my basket of clothes, he was already there, sitting on one of the plastic chairs, watching his own laundry tumble in the machines. The same mask, the same silver studs catching the harsh fluorescent light. He looked up when I entered, and though I couldn't see his expression behind the fabric, I felt a shock of recognition pass between us. Not surprise. Recognition. As if he'd been expecting me, waiting for me to finally understand something crucial. He stood up slowly, deliberately, and walked to the row of washing machines along the far wall. His movements were fluid, purposeful, almost ritualistic. He opened one of the machines and began removing clothes, dark fabric that seemed to absorb rather than reflect the overhead light. As he folded each piece, he placed it carefully in a black canvas bag, his movements precise and methodical. I stood frozen in the doorway, my basket of dirty clothes suddenly feeling impossibly heavy. The laundromat was otherwise empty, just the two of us and the rhythmic churning of the machines. The sound should have been comforting, normal, but instead it felt ominous, like a countdown to something I couldn't name. When he finished with his laundry, he turned toward me one final time. The vapor from his breath, visible despite the laundromat's warmth, formed shapes that lingered in the air between us. This time, I was close enough and paying enough attention to see them clearly. They weren't random patterns. They weren't tricks of light or products of my imagination. They were letters, forming words in a language I almost recognized, but couldn't quite translate. The message hung in the air for several long seconds before slowly dissipating, leaving only the chemical smell of detergent and the mechanical rhythm of the washing machines. He shouldered his bag and walked past me toward the exit, close enough that I could smell something sharp and metallic beneath the fabric softener and soap. Close enough to see that the studs on his mask weren't randomly placed after all, but formed a deliberate pattern, symbols that seemed familiar, though I couldn't place where I might have seen them before. At the doorway, he paused and looked back at me one last time. The fluorescent light caught the studs on his mask, sending tiny reflections dancing across the white painted walls. When he spoke, his voice was muffled but clear, each word carefully enunciated. "See you soon." Then he was gone, leaving me alone with the churning machines and the growing certainty that this encounter had been different from the others. More personal, more purposeful, like a conclusion rather than another random sighting. I never did my laundry that night. Instead, I sat in my car in the parking lot for over an hour, watching the empty laundromat through its plate glass windows, waiting for something to happen. But the machines continued their cycles undisturbed. The fluorescent lights buzzed their electrical song, and eventually I drove home through empty streets that seemed to stretch longer than usual. The final photograph arrived the next morning, but this one was different from the others. Instead of showing me in some public place, unaware of being watched, it was taken inside my apartment, in my bedroom, while I was sleeping. The image showed me lying in bed, one arm flung across the pillow, completely vulnerable and unaware. The angle suggested the photographer had been standing right beside my bed, close enough to touch me, close enough to hear my breathing. The timestamp showed it had been taken just hours before I found it, slipped under my door sometime after I'd left for work. But what made this photograph truly terrifying wasn't the violation of my privacy or the implications about my apartment's security. It was what the image revealed about the room itself. In the background, barely visible in the shadowy corner near my window, was a figure. Tall, thin, wearing what appeared to be a studded mask, standing perfectly still in the darkness. The figure was so still, so integrated into the shadows, that I might have missed it entirely if not for the tiny points of reflected light from the studs on the mask. They formed the same pattern I'd seen before, the same symbols that had seemed almost familiar. But now, studying them more closely in the photograph, I began to recognize what they were. They weren't decorative studs at all. They were holes. Small, precisely drilled holes that went completely through the fabric of the mask, and the light reflecting from them wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from within, from whatever was behind the mask, shining outward through those carefully placed openings. The realization hit me like ice water flooding my veins. The masked figure hadn't been wearing a decorated face covering. He'd been wearing something designed to let light out, not keep it away. Those weren't studs catching external illumination. They were windows, portals, openings that revealed something underneath that generated its own glow. I called in sick to work that day and spent hours studying the photograph with a magnifying glass, examining every detail I could make out in the dim bedroom lighting. The more I looked, the more convinced I became that the holes in the mask weren't random. They formed a pattern, a constellation of points that seemed to shift and move even in the static image, creating the illusion of text or symbols that appeared and disappeared, depending on how I held the photograph. But it was the figure's posture that disturbed me most. The way it stood in my bedroom, perfectly still and upright, suggested it had been there for some time. Not hiding, not attempting to conceal itself, but simply waiting, watching. Present in my most private space with a patience that suggested infinite time and absolute confidence that it wouldn't be discovered. I moved out of the apartment that weekend, packing only essential items and leaving everything else behind. I found a small furnished place across town, paid 6 months in advance in cash, and told no one my new address. I changed my phone number again, closed my social media accounts, and even considered changing my name entirely. For 2 weeks, I thought I'd succeeded in disappearing. No more photographs appeared. No more sightings of the masked figure. No more feeling of being constantly watched. I began to hope that whatever had been happening was finally over. That distance and anonymity had broken whatever connection had existed between us. But last night, as I walked home from the corner store with groceries for my new apartment, I saw him again. Standing beneath a broken streetlight at the end of my new block, perfectly motionless in the pool of darkness where the illumination should have been. The same tall, thin silhouette. The same studded mask catching and reflecting light that shouldn't have been there. As I watched, frozen on the sidewalk with my grocery bag clutched against my chest, he raised one hand in what might have been a greeting. His breath formed shapes in the cold air. Letters, words, messages I still couldn't quite decipher but somehow understood on a level deeper than language. Then he turned and walked away, disappearing into the maze of side streets and alleyways that surrounded my new building. But not before I noticed something that made my blood run cold. He was carrying a camera. Story 12. The highway Starbucks where I work sits like a fluorescent island in an ocean of asphalt and diesel fumes. Most nights, the only sound is the distant hum of 18-wheelers carrying their cargo toward destinations I'll never see. But that Tuesday night in October, when the backpacker walked in with mud caked on his boots and something wrong behind his eyes, everything changed. He ordered black coffee and sat in the corner booth, the one with the torn vinyl that nobody ever bothers to fix. His backpack looked like it had been through hell. Frayed straps, patches of duct tape, and stains that could have been anything. The hunting knife on his belt caught the overhead lights every time he shifted, its worn leather sheath suggesting years of use. I was wiping down tables when he approached the counter again, his movements too fluid for someone who should have been tired from the road. His voice carried a strange accent I couldn't place, something that seemed to shift between syllables. "My phone died," he said, gesturing toward my device charging behind the register. "Mind if I borrow yours? Just need to call my ride." The rational part of my brain screamed warnings, but there's something about working alone at night that makes you crave human interaction, even when every instinct tells you to run. I handed him the phone, watching as his calloused fingers moved across the screen with surprising familiarity. He disappeared into the single-stall bathroom, and I heard the muffled sound of conversation through the thin walls. The words were indistinct, but the tone felt urgent, almost desperate. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours. The coffee maker gurgled. The refrigeration units hummed their mechanical lullabies. Outside, a truck downshifted in the distance, its engine brake echoing like thunder across the empty lot. When he emerged, something had changed in his demeanor. He moved with purpose now, no longer the weary traveler seeking refuge. He set my phone on the counter and reached into his pack, pulling out a small SD card that caught the light like a black mirror. "Keep this safe," he said, pressing the card into my palm. His skin felt fevered, almost burning. "Someone will come for it eventually." Before I could respond, he was gone, slipping out the glass doors and disappearing into the darkness beyond the parking lot's edge. I stood there holding the SD card, its plastic surface warm against my skin, wondering if I'd imagined the entire encounter. The rest of my shift passed in a haze of routine tasks, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted. The familiar environment felt different now, as if the very air had taken on a new texture. Shadows seemed deeper in the corners where the fluorescent lights couldn't reach. The automatic doors kept triggering without anyone there, letting in bursts of cold October air that carried unfamiliar scents. At home in my studio apartment, curiosity finally overcame caution. I slipped the SD card into my laptop and waited as the files loaded. Dozens of video files filled the screen, each time-stamped over the past several months. The first few showed what appeared to be security camera footage of train tunnels, long, dark passages carved through rock and earth. Empty tracks stretched into blackness, occasionally illuminated by work lights that cast harsh shadows on concrete walls. The footage was hypnotically monotonous. Train after train passed through these underground passages, their headlights cutting through the darkness like searchlights. But something about the videos felt wrong, though I couldn't pinpoint what. The tunnels all looked identical, yet the timestamps suggested they were recorded in different locations across the country. The trains themselves seemed to move with an odd rhythm, sometimes too fast, sometimes impossibly slow. I fast-forwarded through hours of similar content, each video blurring into the next. The tunnels began to feel familiar, as if I'd walked through them myself. The sound of steel wheels on track became a soundtrack that followed me even when I paused the videos, my apartment filled with the phantom echo of distant locomotives. It was in the final video that I saw myself. The timestamp read 3 weeks ago, a Tuesday night, just like tonight. The camera angle was different from the others, positioned lower and at an odd tilt. At first, I saw only the familiar darkness of another tunnel, but as a train's headlight swept across the frame, it illuminated something impossible. There I was, in my green Starbucks apron, methodically wiping down a table. But the table wasn't in my coffee shop. It sat in the middle of the tunnel, surrounded by railroad tracks and concrete walls. I watched myself perform the familiar motions with mechanical precision, spray bottle in one hand, rag in the other, completely oblivious to the train bearing down on my location. The locomotive passed through me like I was made of smoke. My hands trembled as I replayed the footage, searching for signs of digital manipulation or clever editing. But the quality was too poor, the lighting too natural. Every detail of my movements matched my memory of that night 3 weeks ago. The way I always started with the left side of the table, the specific pattern I used to ensure no streaks remained on the surface. Sleep became elusive. Every time I closed my eyes, I found myself walking through endless tunnels, the sound of approaching trains growing louder with each step. During my shifts at the coffee shop, I caught myself staring at the security camera mounted in the corner, wondering if someone was watching footage of me going through the motions of my routine, unaware that I was performing for an audience I couldn't see. The next few days blurred together in a haze of growing unease. Customers seemed different, their faces more angular, their voices carrying undertones that made my skin crawl. The familiar rhythm of the coffee shop felt disrupted, as if everyone was moving slightly out of sync with reality. I found myself checking and rechecking my phone, convinced that someone had accessed it while I wasn't looking. The SD card had become an obsession. I carried it everywhere, the small piece of plastic feeling heavier with each passing hour. Sometimes I thought I could hear faint sounds coming from within it, the distant rumble of trains, the echo of footsteps in concrete passages. When I held it up to my ear, pressing the hard edges against my skin, I swore I could detect the rhythm of my own heartbeat synchronized with the phantom sounds of underground railways. A week after the backpackers' visit, I noticed the first discrepancy in my memory. I was certain I'd worked a double shift the previous Tuesday, but my timesheet showed otherwise. The security footage from that night was corrupted, showing only static and occasional flashes of what might have been movement in the store. My manager mentioned that I'd seemed distracted lately, asking if everything was okay at home. That's when I started keeping a journal, documenting every detail of my shifts and daily routine. If my memory was failing, I needed external verification of my experiences. But as the entries accumulated, I discovered gaps that troubled me more than forgotten hours. There were descriptions of customers I couldn't remember serving, detailed accounts of conversations that felt foreign despite being written in my own handwriting. The most disturbing entry was dated 2 nights ago. The tunnel opened behind the coffee machine tonight. The rails extend all the way to the storage room. I can hear them calling my name from the darkness beyond the reach of the work lights. Soon, I think I'll have to answer. I had no memory of writing those words. The backpacker returned on a rainy Thursday night, appearing in the doorway like a figure from a half-remembered dream. His clothes were different, cleaner somehow, despite the mud that still clung to his boots. The hunting knife was gone from his belt, but something else had taken its place, a small device that looked like a GPS unit but displayed symbols I didn't recognize. He approached the counter with the same fluid movements, but this time his eyes held a quality I hadn't noticed before, a depth that suggested he was looking through me rather than at me. When he spoke, His voice carried harmonics that seemed to resonate in my chest cavity. "Did you watch them?" he asked, though I was certain we'd never discussed the contents of the SD card. I nodded, unable to find my voice. The journal in my back pocket felt warm against my skin, as if the pages were burning with unwritten words. "The tunnels connect everything," he continued, his gaze drifting toward the security camera. "Past, present, future. All the places you've been, all the places you're going. The trains just help you remember the routes you've already traveled." He reached across the counter and touched my forehead with one finger. The contact sent electricity through my skull, and suddenly I could see the coffee shop as it really was. A way station built over an intersection of underground passages that stretched in directions my mind couldn't properly process. The familiar space existed simultaneously in multiple locations, connected by rails that carried more than just locomotives. "Your shift isn't over," he said, withdrawing his hand. "It's just beginning." When I blinked, he was gone again, but this time I could see the entrance to the tunnel behind the coffee machine, just as my journal had described. The opening pulsed with its own rhythm, and from somewhere in the depths came the sound of my name being called by voices I almost recognized. My reflection in the store windows looked wrong now, sometimes showing me in my work apron, sometimes in clothes I'd never owned, sometimes not showing me at all. The security camera tracked my movements with mechanical precision, recording footage that would eventually find its way onto another SD card, to be discovered by another night shift worker in another highway coffee shop. The trains are calling again. I can hear them approaching from both directions, their headlights already visible in the tunnel mouth that opens and closes with each breath I take. My shift ends in 20 minutes, but I understand now that the schedule posted behind the counter is just another illusion. I'm reaching for my apron, preparing to clean the tables one more time. Somewhere in the darkness beyond the work lights, a camera is recording my movements with patient precision. Tomorrow, or perhaps yesterday, someone else will find the SD card and watch these same motions played out in a tunnel that exists everywhere and nowhere. The trains are almost here now. Time to get back to work. Story 13. The first time I noticed the white Ford probe, I was leaving Murphy's Diner with grease still coating my fingers and the taste of overcooked hash browns lingering in my mouth. The October evening had settled into that peculiar twilight that makes everything look slightly wrong, as if the world had been photographed through a dirty lens. I fumbled with my keys in the parking lot, the cold metal slipping between my sweaty palms, when I caught sight of it in my peripheral vision. White as old bone, sitting 3 spaces away with its engine running. The exhaust created lazy spirals in the cooling air, and I could hear the distinctive rumble of an older V6 engine. Nothing unusual about that. Murphy's attracted all kinds of cars, from rusted pickups to pristine classics. But something about the way it sat there, perfectly still except for that gentle vibration of idle, made the hair on my arms stand up. I climbed into my Honda and pulled out of the lot, checking my rearview mirror out of habit. The probe fell in behind me, maintaining a careful distance of exactly 2 car lengths. When I turned left onto Maple Street, it turned left. When I slowed for the school zone, it slowed. When I accelerated past the old cemetery, it matched my speed with mechanical precision. By the time I reached the intersection near my house, my hands were slick with perspiration despite the evening chill. I decided to test my growing suspicion and took a circuitous route through the Riverside neighborhood, winding through streets I hadn't driven in months. Oak Avenue, then Birch Lane, then a quick right onto Cedar Street. The probe followed each turn with the patience of a predator stalking wounded prey. My heart hammered against my ribs as I finally pulled into my driveway on Elmwood Street. The white car continued past without slowing, its tinted windows revealing nothing of the driver within. I sat in my car for several minutes, engine off, listening to the tick of cooling metal and the distant hum of traffic. The street looked normal, Mrs. Henderson's porch light casting its usual warm glow, the Johnson's sprinkler system creating small rainbows in the fading light. But normal felt like a mask that could slip at any moment. I convinced myself it was coincidence. People drive the same routes, especially in a town as small as ours. The fact that someone happened to be heading in the same direction was hardly evidence of anything sinister. I repeated this logic like a mantra as I walked to my front door, keys jingling with each step. The weekend passed without incident, and by Monday morning, the white probe had become nothing more than an odd memory, the kind of thing that seems significant in the moment but loses its weight in daylight. I returned to my routine: work at the insurance office, lunch at the same sandwich shop, groceries at the supermarket on 5th Street. But Friday evening, as I was leaving Thompson's bar after a few beers with colleagues, I saw it again. Same white Ford probe, same running engine, same bone-pale paint that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. This time it was parked across the street, angled so that whoever sat inside would have a clear view of the bar's entrance. I stood on the sidewalk, pretending to check my phone while studying the vehicle. The windows were too dark to reveal any occupants, but I could see shadows moving within, restless, agitated movements that suggested multiple people. The logical part of my mind supplied reasonable explanations. People meeting for dinner, friends waiting for someone to finish their drink, a designated driver checking their phone. But the primitive part of my brain, the part that had kept my ancestors alive when darker things than cars stalked the night, whispered different theories. I walked quickly to my Honda, glancing over my shoulder every few steps. The probe's engine note changed as I approached my car, shifting from idle to a slightly higher RPM, as if the driver had pressed the accelerator in anticipation. I fumbled with my keys, dropped them, retrieved them from the asphalt with hands that trembled more than the cold weather justified. The drive home followed the same pattern as the previous Friday. The white car maintained its precise 2-car length distance, matching my every move with mechanical consistency. When I tested it again, turning down random streets, doubling back, even stopping at a gas station I didn't need, it followed with the persistence of a faithful dog. This time, when I reached my street, I didn't pull into my driveway. Instead, I parked at the curb and waited, engine running, hands gripping the steering wheel hard enough to leave indentations in the vinyl. The probe appeared at the end of the block, moving at exactly the speed limit, and stopped directly across from my house. We sat there in a mechanical standoff, 2 engines idling in the gathering darkness. I could see shapes moving behind the tinted glass. Definitely more than one person, their silhouettes shifting and gesticulating as if engaged in heated discussion. But when I tried to focus on details, the shapes seemed to blur and distort, like looking at something underwater. After 20 minutes that felt like hours, I gave up and went inside. The probe remained in position for another hour before disappearing into the night, leaving only the smell of exhaust and the growing certainty that this was far from over. I called the police the next morning, explaining the situation to a bored dispatcher who took my information with the enthusiasm of someone filing reports about stolen garden gnomes. Officer Martinez arrived that afternoon, a young man with kind eyes and the particular brand of patience that comes from dealing with paranoid citizens on a regular basis. We walked around my property while I described the previous night's events. He made notes in a small pad, nodding at appropriate intervals, but I could see the skepticism in his expression. No laws had been broken. No threats had been made. Someone driving on public streets, even repeatedly, wasn't grounds for harassment charges. "Has anyone approached you directly?" he asked, pen poised over his notepad. I admitted they hadn't. "Have you received any phone calls, letters, or other forms of contact?" Again, no. "Have you recently ended a relationship, changed jobs, or had any disputes with neighbors or coworkers?" Nothing significant came to mind. Officer Martinez closed his notepad with a soft snap. He suggested I keep a log of any future incidents, install security cameras if I felt the need, and call immediately if the situation escalated. His tone was professional but carried the subtle dismissal reserved for complaints that fell into the category of probable imagination. The third Friday arrived with the weight of inevitability. I found myself checking my rearview mirror constantly throughout the day, scanning parking lots with the nervous attention of prey animal. When evening came, I decided to skip my usual routine entirely. Instead of going out, I would stay home, order pizza, and watch old movies until bedtime. At 8:47 p.m., as I was settling into my couch with a beer and a slice of pepperoni pizza, I heard the familiar rumble of a V6 engine outside my window. The white Ford Probe sat in its usual spot across the street, engine running, shadows moving behind the tinted glass. But this time, something was different. The car seemed to sag slightly, as if weighted down by some invisible burden. I stepped onto my front porch for a better look, the cool air raising goosebumps along my arms. The tires looked deflated, not completely flat, but significantly lower than normal air pressure would explain. All 4 tires exhibited the same condition, giving the vehicle a squatted appearance that defied mechanical logic. Car tires didn't lose air uniformly unless someone had deliberately deflated them, and even then, the pattern was wrong. These tires looked as if something had sucked the air out from within, leaving them partially collapsed but still functional. I grabbed my phone and stepped back inside, fingers shaking as I dialed 911. The dispatcher's voice was crisp and professional, but I could hear the same skeptical undertone I'd encountered before. Yes, she would send a unit to investigate. No, I shouldn't approach the vehicle myself. Yes, I should remain inside until officers arrived. The response time was exactly 12 minutes. I counted every second on my kitchen clock, watching the white car through my window, while the shadows continued their restless dance behind the glass. When the patrol car finally appeared, its red and blue lights painting my street in alternating colors, I felt a surge of vindication. Officer Martinez emerged from the squad car with measured steps, his hand resting on his radio. He approached the probe cautiously, flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. I watched from my window as he circled the vehicle, peering through the windows, checking the license plate. The car was empty, completely, utterly empty. No restless shadows, no movement, no signs that anyone had ever been inside. The engine was cold, the tires properly inflated, the interior visible through windows that were no longer tinted, but clear as ordinary glass. Officer Martinez spent another 20 minutes examining the vehicle and the surrounding area. He ran the license plate, checked for signs of forced entry, even looked under the hood. Everything was normal. Legal registration, no outstanding warrants, no evidence of tampering or illegal activity. When he knocked on my door, his expression carried a mixture of concern and professional doubt. He explained what he'd found, or rather, what he hadn't found. The car appeared to be legally parked, properly maintained, and completely abandoned. He would follow up with the registered owner, but unless I had additional evidence of harassment or threatening behavior, there wasn't much more he could do. I tried to explain about the tires, the shadows, the tinted windows that had somehow become transparent. My words sounded hollow and desperate, even to my own ears. Officer Martinez listened with the patient attention of someone accustomed to dealing with stress-induced paranoia, making appropriate noises of sympathy while clearly documenting what he considered to be a mental health episode. After he left, I stood at my window staring at the empty white car. It sat there for the rest of the night, ordinary and harmless, like an automotive prop abandoned on a movie set. But I knew what I had seen. The certainty burned in my chest like acid reflux, impossible to ignore despite the complete lack of supporting evidence. The 4th Friday, I was ready. I had spent the week installing a security camera system that covered my front yard and the street beyond. High definition, night vision capable, motion-activated recording. If something unusual happened, I would have proof. No more relying on my own increasingly unreliable perceptions. I also purchased a digital tire pressure gauge and made careful notes about normal tire inflation levels for a Ford Probe of that particular year and model. If the tires were indeed deflating in some impossible manner, I would document it with scientific precision. The white car arrived at exactly 8:47 p.m., just as it had the previous week. I watched through my window as it settled into its familiar position, engine running, exhaust creating small clouds in the cool air. This time I forced myself to remain calm, observing with the detached attention of a scientist studying an interesting phenomenon. The shadows began their restless movement almost immediately. darker patches shifting behind windows that appeared tinted from the outside but somehow became transparent when viewed directly. I grabbed my phone and began recording video through the window, zooming in on the areas where movement was most apparent. On my phone screen, the car looked completely normal. No shadows, no movement, no tinted windows, just an ordinary white Ford Probe sitting empty under the streetlight. I checked the security camera feed on my laptop. Same result. Perfectly normal vehicle, no occupants, no unusual activity. Even the live feed showed nothing but an empty car while my own eyes continued to register impossible movement within. The contradiction made my stomach churn with a nausea that had nothing to do with physical illness. Either my perception was so fundamentally compromised that I could no longer trust my own senses, or something was happening that existed outside the normal boundaries of what cameras and electronic devices could record. I grabbed the tire pressure gauge and walked outside, moving across the street with the forced casualness of someone pretending not to be terrified. The October air carried the scent of dying leaves and wood smoke from someone's fireplace. Normal autumn smells that somehow felt wrong in the context of the white car's presence. As I approached the vehicle, I could hear sounds from within. Muffled voices engaged in urgent conversation, the rustle of movement, even what sounded like paper being shuffled. But when I looked directly through the windows, I saw only empty seats and normal interior surfaces. The tires were definitely deflated, sagging under the car's weight with a consistency that violated every mechanical principle I understood. I knelt beside the front passenger tire and pressed the gauge against the valve stem. The reading was impossible. Negative pressure, as if something inside the tire was actively pulling air inward rather than simply leaking it outward. I tested all 4 tires with the same result. Each one showed readings that shouldn't have been possible with conventional equipment, pressures so low that the car should have been sitting on its rims, yet somehow still functional enough to have driven to this location. A tap on the passenger window made me drop the pressure gauge with a metallic clatter. I looked up to see a hand pressed against the glass from inside, pale, slightly translucent, with fingers that seemed to have too many joints. The hand moved in a slow waving motion, as if greeting an old friend. But when I blinked and looked again, there was nothing but empty space and the reflection of the streetlight. I ran back to my house, heart hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. Behind me, the white car's engine note changed, rising to a higher pitch before settling back to its normal idle. I slammed my front door and locked it, then checked the security camera feed again. The footage showed me walking calmly across the street, kneeling beside an ordinary car with properly inflated tires, and then returning to my house at a normal pace. No running, no obvious distress, no evidence of the terror that had driven me back inside. The white Ford Probe remained in position until exactly 3:33 a.m., when it simply disappeared between one frame and the next, not driving away, disappearing, as if it had never been there at all. I spent the rest of the night staring at the empty street, wondering if I was losing my mind, or if something far worse was happening. The distinction seemed increasingly irrelevant as Friday approached once again, bringing with it the certainty that the white car would return. And each time it did, the tires would be a little more deflated, as if whatever lived inside was growing stronger, consuming more of the air that separated its world from mine. The boundary between real and impossible was wearing thin, one deflated tire at a time. And I was beginning to suspect that when it finally collapsed completely, I might discover which side of reality I truly belonged on.